Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to a time when your personal hygiene routine was less about self-care and more about, well, survival. Imagine you've just been dropped into a muddy, bustling village in the year 1350. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, wet earth, and something else, something less than pleasant. You instinctively wrinkle your nose. This isn't the kind of history you read in a textbook. This is the kind you experience with all your senses. And trust me, some of them are going to be working overtime. It's a world without running water, without a single roll of toilet paper, and where a communal bath might just be the social event of the season. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry. It's just a thought experiment. It's a journey into the nitty-gritty, the smelly, and the surprisingly fascinating aspects of daily life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching this in Vietnam, or maybe in London, or wherever you are in the world, feel free to post your location and local time down in the comments. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a muddy path, the packed earth slick beneath your worn leather shoes. The sun is low, casting long shadows from the wattle and daub huts that line the way. You can hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the lowing of a cow. But what truly commands your attention is the smell. It's an intricate bouquet of smells, really. There's the sweet, smoky scent of hearth fires, the sour tang of fermenting grain from a local alehouse, and the earthy, rich aroma of the nearby fields. But beneath it all, an ever-present baseline, is the powerful, pungent smell of human and animal waste. It's everywhere. It seeps from the ground, hangs in the air, and seems to cling to the very fabric of your clothes. This is not the sanitized, romanticized Middle Ages you see in movies. This is the real deal. You try to take a deep breath, but it's a losing battle. A couple of scruffy pigs root happily in a shallow, refuse-filled ditch that runs alongside the path. They seem perfectly content. A group of children, their faces smudged with dirt, laugh as they chase a stray chicken. They're barefoot, and you wince as you watch them splash through a puddle that you know, with a sinking feeling, is not just rainwater. Historians still argue whether the general public was simply accustomed to these smells, or if they developed a sort of olfactory fatigue, a kind of nose blindness to the constant assault. Some believe that the constant exposure meant they simply didn't register the odors in the same way a person from our time would. Others posit that they used strong-smelling herbs and flowers to try and mask the worst of it. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. You see a woman emerge from a small hut, carrying a bucket. She walks to the ditch, her expression completely neutral, and unceremoniously dumps the contents, a foul, grey liquid, into the flowing muck. The water swirls with a new, dark cloud of filth. This act, so casual and commonplace, is a powerful reminder that our modern understanding of sanitation is just that. Modern, the notion of a dedicated, sealed sewage system is not only unheard of but conceptually alien. It's just not how things work. Here, waste is simply part of the landscape, a byproduct of life that is dealt with in the most direct and least complicated way possible. A quirky tidbit that puts a fine point on it: in many medieval towns, the town crier would announce a gong farmer was in town, a specialized laborer whose job it was to empty cesspits. The term gong was a euphemism for the pit itself. You can imagine the social standing of such a person. It was a smelly, terrible job, but it was essential. You watch as a man, perhaps a travelling merchant, pulls his cart through the main thoroughfare. The cartwheel hits a particularly deep rut, and a geyser of brown mud sprays up, coating the side of a nearby building. The merchant barely flinches. He simply trudges onward, muttering to himself. It's a scene of organised chaos. A living ecosystem of people, animals, and germs all coexisting in a way that seems, to your modern mind, impossible. You know, we spend so much time today trying to eliminate germs, to sanitize every surface, to create a pristine environment, but here, you realize, the germs aren't the enemy. They're just the backdrop. They're a given. And as the sun finally dips below the horizon, and the air grows a little cooler, you feel a faint, prickly sensation on your arm. You don't dare scratch it. You're already part of the ecosystem. As you step deeper into the village, The path widens into a main thoroughfare. The smells, which were a low hum on the outskirts, now hit you like a wave. You pass by a tanner's shop, and the potent, acrid scent of animal hides and urine assaults your nostrils. This isn't a fleeting odour. It's a heavy, permanent cloud that hangs over the entire corner of the street. Tanning was a crucial trade, but it was also one of the stinkiest, and tanners were often relegated to the outskirts of town for that very reason. But here, in this small village, there's no outskirts, just more of the same. Just past the tanner, you notice a butcher's stall. The meat is hanging in the open, attracting a buzzing cloud of flies. You try to suppress a shudder. There's no refrigeration. Of course, preservation is done with salt or by smoking, but the fresh cuts are sold and consumed quickly. The air carries a faint, sickly sweet smell of decay, a stark reminder of the tenuous line between food and spoilage. You see a woman carrying a bucket of what you can only assume is household waste. She pauses, looks around, and with a practiced motion, simply tosses the contents out an open window onto the path below. It's a truly shocking sight for your modern sensibilities. You instinctively step back, narrowly avoiding the splash. This is the simple, brutal reality of waste disposal in an era without infrastructure. The term night soil comes to mind. The polite name for the human waste collected from latrines, but in many cases there was no collection. It was simply a matter of out of sight, out of mind, and usually that meant out the window and into the street. Historians still argue whether this practice, known as tossing the chamber pot, was a common occurrence or an exaggerated stereotype. Some urban ordinances existed to fine people for it, which suggests it was a problem to be solved. But a quirky tidbit is that, in some cities, a warning cry like Gardez-l'eau, a corruption of the French Gardez l'eau, or watch out for the water, was required before you tossed your slop from a window. It was the medieval equivalent of a car horn. You look up at the woman, who doesn't seem to notice your horrified expression. She simply turns and disappears back into her home. The bucket now empty. You keep walking, the mud squelching under your feet. It's not just the smell, it's the texture of the street itself. It's a mashup of mud, spilled beer, animal droppings, and who knows what else. A dog is lapping from a shallow puddle. You quickly look away. The sheer volume of waste is overwhelming. There are no public trash cans, no city sanitation services. Every household is its own little world of waste management. And the easiest solution is almost always the same. Get it out of the house. You see a boy leading a horse and cart, and you think, finally, some sort of clean-up. But as the cart goes by, you see it's filled with straw, likely headed for a stable, not a dump. The horse leaves its own little contribution to the street surface, and the cycle continues. There's a constant, low-level hum of buzzing flies and the occasional scurry of a rat. You realize that a lot of what we consider pests today were simply part of the landscape back then. They were the unofficial sanitation crew, cleaning up what humans left behind, for better or for worse. The lack of sanitation wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a major public health issue. You can see the visible evidence of this everywhere. People with pockmarked faces, open sores, or a telltale pallor are common sights. While we'll get to the big diseases later, even minor illnesses were a constant threat. A simple cut could lead to a deadly infection. A stomachache could be a sign of something much worse. There's a certain grim fatalism in the air, a sense that life is short and precarious. You step over a small, meandering stream that's a murky, brownish colour. A man is washing his hands in it. The water looks far from clean. You remember reading about a mainstream historical fact that many towns and cities grew up around rivers, using them as both a source of water for drinking and a convenient place to dump waste. This created a vicious cycle of contamination and disease. People were literally drinking their own sewage. It's a difficult thought to process, but it's the reality you're standing in right now. The simple act of getting a drink of water was a roll of the dice. You can feel a phantom itch on your arms and legs. It's not real, but the power of suggestion is strong. You just want to find a place that's clean. But as you look around, you realize that word doesn't have the same meaning here. You're still standing in the middle of this medieval thoroughfare, and you really, really need to use the restroom. Your modern mind immediately starts searching for a sign, a symbol, anything that looks like a public convenience, but there's nothing. So you look to the buildings. A tavern is nearby, its door slightly ajar. You imagine stepping inside, but then you remember the lack of indoor plumbing. Where do people go. This brings us to the fascinating, and frankly, gross, reality of medieval latrines. For the common person, the options were limited. A small, simple privy, a bucket, or simply a secluded spot in the woods if you lived in the countryside. But in a town, things were a little different. You look down a narrow alleyway and see what looks like a small, wooden shack. This is a public latrine. It's a simple structure, often built over a ditch, a river, or a cesspit. Inside, you might find a wooden bench with a series of holes cut into it. There are no dividers, no privacy. People would sit shoulder to shoulder, conducting their business while chatting with their neighbours. It was a communal, social act, a truly shocking idea to our modern minds, but it was just a part of life. A quirky tidbit is that these communal latrines were often so poorly maintained that people would use them as a place to dispose of household garbage, further clogging them and making them even more unsanitary. It was a vicious cycle. The smell, you can only imagine, was a potent combination of everything you've smelled so far, but concentrated. You can almost feel the damp, foul air on your skin from just looking at it. Historians still argue whether the concept of privacy in such situations was something people even considered. Some scholars believe that the idea of a private, solitary space for bodily functions is a relatively modern invention, and that for most of human history, it was a group activity. Others suggest that even in the Middle Ages, people sought out private moments, but the physical limitations of their world made it difficult. The lack of privacy was simply a pragmatic reality they had to live with. You see a man emerge from the latrine, his face unreadable. He simply pulls his tunic down and walks away, a little bit of straw clinging to the bottom of his shoe. Straw was a common substitute for toilet paper, often simply a handful from a nearby pile, or, if you were lucky, you had a moss-covered stone or a piece of fabric you could use. This lack of sanitation had a direct and deadly impact. A mainstream historical fact is that the spread of diseases like dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera was directly linked to contaminated water sources and the poor disposal of human waste. The close proximity of privies to wells and rivers created the perfect conditions for epidemics. People were literally poisoning their own water supply without understanding the connection. They would attribute the sickness to bad air, or miasma, or even to divine punishment. But the true culprit was right there in the water they were drinking. You think about the bucket of slop you saw tossed from the window, and you realize it's all connected. The waste on the street, the waste in the river, the waste in the cesspit, it's all part of the same biological loop, and the people in this village are trapped inside it. You also have to consider the social function of these places. A trip to the latrine wasn't just about answering nature's call, it was a chance to catch up on the latest gossip, to share news, or to complain about the price of bread. It was a truly intimate community space, whether you wanted it to be or not. You can hear the low murmur of voices from inside the latrine as you pass by. A strange mix of everyday conversation and the unmistakable sounds of bodily functions. It's a strange and unsettling combination. You imagine a group of men discussing the harvest while sitting side by side on a wooden plank over a stinking pit. It's both comical and deeply unsettling. The line between public and private was a lot blurrier back then. As you continue your walk, you'll be on the lookout for a cleaner place to do your business, but you're starting to suspect you won't find one. The idea of a personal, clean bathroom with running water and a flush toilet is starting to feel like the most luxurious thing you can imagine. Having successfully navigated the communal latrine and the accompanying social awkwardness, you're now thinking about something else entirely, a bath. The grime from the road seems to have settled on you like a second skin, but where would you even begin? In the Middle Ages, bathing was not the daily ritual we know today. It was a rare, often communal, and somewhat suspect activity. A mainstream historical fact is that while Romans were famous for their elaborate bathhouses, their collapse led to a significant decline in public bathing. By the time of our medieval journey, full-body bathing was a luxury, and often seen as a possible gateway to sin or sickness. You see a woman carrying a bucket of water from the well, but it's not for bathing, it's for cooking or drinking, for personal hygiene. You're more likely to use a small basin and a pitcher of water in your own home. You would wash your hands and face, and perhaps your feet. But a full bath was a much bigger production. It required heating a lot of water, which took a significant amount of wood or charcoal. And it was a time-consuming chore. You remember a quirky tidbit about this. People would often bathe in the same water. The head of the household, usually the man, would go first. Then the rest of the family would follow in descending order of importance, with the children and servants going last. By the time the final person got in, the water was, to put it mildly, less than fresh. This is probably where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from. It's a funny thought, but it was a serious reality. Historians still argue whether the decline of bathing was due to religious reasons or simply a matter of practicality. Some scholars believe that the early Christian church discouraged communal bathing due to its association with Roman promiscuity and hedonism. Others argue that it was purely a matter of resource management. Wood for heating and water were precious commodities, and a full-body bath was simply not a priority when compared to cooking or staying warm. You look at the simple, wood-framed huts and can see the logic in this. There's no easy way to get hot water on demand. Everything is a chore, and a bath is a big one. So, instead of a full bath, you'd likely use a moistened cloth to wipe down your body. You'd also rely on other things to keep you feeling fresh. Herbs were a big part of this. You might use aromatic plants like lavender, rosemary, or thyme to create a kind of herbal infusion to mix with your washing water. People would also rub these herbs on their skin or wear them in small pouches to mask body odor. The idea wasn't to eliminate the smell, it was to cover it up with something more pleasant. You see a woman walking by with a small bundle of lavender pinned to her tunic. She smells faintly of summer fields. A stark contrast to the general atmosphere of the village. It's a small, personal act of rebellion against the prevailing odor, even for the wealthy. A bath was a formal affair. The nobles might have had a large, wooden tub in their chambers, but it was still a rare event. They would have servants carry water from the well, heat it over the fire, and pour it into the tub. And even then, it wasn't a daily thing, maybe once a week, or once a month, depending on the season and the amount of water available. The idea of a daily shower is a completely foreign concept, a modern luxury that would be impossible to even imagine. You feel a faint shiver of disgust and a new appreciation for your own home. The simple act of turning on a tap and having a seemingly endless supply of clean, hot water is a kind of magic that people in this time could never have dreamed of. As you continue your journey, you realize that true cleanliness was a constant, and often losing, battle. After observing the limited bathing practices, your thoughts turn to the most fundamental element of all, water. In our world, we take clean water for granted. We have it piped directly into our homes, filtered and treated to be safe for drinking. But here, in a medieval village, it's a very different story. You continue your walk and find yourself at the village well, which is, without a doubt, the social and practical heart of this community. A small group of women are gathered, their conversation a low hum as they haul up heavy buckets. This is a daily ritual, a constant chore. The water is clear, drawn from deep underground, and it looks pristine in the sunlight, but looks can be deceiving. A mainstream historical fact is that wells were often dug far too close to cesspits, graves, and animal pens. There was a fundamental misunderstanding of how contaminants travelled through the soil. What you see as clean water might be seeping with unseen waste. The well is a lifeline, but it's a double-edged sword. A single contaminated source could, and often did, wipe out entire families and neighbourhoods. You watch a young woman dip a small wooden ladle into the bucket and take a drink. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't think about it. It's an act of pure trust in a world where trust is often all you have. You also see a small stream that runs through the village. It's the same murky one from before, but now you notice a group of children playing in it. This stream serves multiple purposes. It's where they water their animals, where some people do their laundry, and, as you saw, where they dispose of waste. It's a single waterway for a multitude of uses, and it's a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. You remember a quirky tidbit about this. In some larger towns, ordinances were passed to try and keep the rivers clean, but they were almost impossible to enforce. People would simply dump their waste under the cover of darkness, or pay off a local official. The river was just too convenient a sewer to resist. This is a world where nature's waste management system is the primary one, for better or for worse. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the link between dirty water and sickness. Some scholars believe they had a basic, empirical understanding. If you drink from that foul-looking puddle, you'll get a tummy ache. but that they lacked the scientific knowledge of microbes and bacteria. Others argue that they had a deeper, intuitive knowledge, but that their daily lives and lack of technology simply prevented them from acting on it. It's hard to imagine, but the concept of a single, invisible organism causing a deadly disease was a completely foreign idea. When a plague struck, they looked for answers in the stars, in divine will, or in the actions of their enemies. They didn't look in their well. You watch as a man walks his oxen down to the stream to drink. The animals seem unbothered by the state of the water. You notice a bit of discarded cloth floating by, and you can't help but think about all the unseen things in the water with it. You've heard about the famous London pump handle that was the source of a cholera outbreak in the 19th century, and how a doctor, John Snow, proved that the source of the disease was the contaminated water. That was a revolutionary discovery, but it was centuries away from the time and place you're standing in now. You can almost feel the historical chasm between their reality and yours. The simple act of getting a glass of water has never felt so complex, so fraught with unseen dangers. You feel a sudden, intense thirst, and you look at the well, then at the stream, and you realize that a simple drink is a choice between two bad options. And then you remember you're not actually here, you're just listening, and you feel a faint, sweet relief wash over you. With the unsettling reality of water sources in mind, you move on, and your attention is drawn to a woman scrubbing a pile of clothes on a flat stone near the stream. This isn't a modern washing machine or even a simple washboard. This is the real deal, and it brings you to the fascinating and often unpleasant topic of medieval laundry. A mainstream historical fact is that soap as we know it, a solid bar for personal cleanliness, was rare and expensive. It was usually made from animal fats and lye, and its primary use was for laundry and a few industrial applications. For personal washing, you were more likely to use a coarse cloth and a bit of water, but for clothes, it was a different story. The woman at the stream is using a substance that makes you wince. It's not soap, not exactly. It's lye, a highly alkaline substance made from wood ashes. It's harsh and corrosive, but it was an effective cleaning agent. She's also using something even more shocking, stale human urine. Urine contains ammonia, a powerful degreaser and stain remover. A quirky tidbit is that urine was so widely used for both laundry and the tanning of leather that it was a valuable commodity. People would collect it in buckets in their homes and sell it to launderers or tanners. It was a trade, a stinky but necessary part of the medieval economy. You can almost smell the pungent, ammoniacal odour mixing with the damp earth and the other scents of the village. It's a truly humbling experience to realise that what we flushed down the toilet was once a valuable, multi-purpose cleaning product. Historians still argue whether the urine used for cleaning was always stale or if some people used it fresh. The process of allowing it to ferment, or age, increases the concentration of ammonia, making it more effective. Some scholars believe that this aging process was a well-known bit of practical knowledge passed down through generations. Others argue that it was simply used as it was available, with little thought to its potency. The debate highlights how much of this history is based on conjecture and the interpretation of very sparse evidence. We can't interview the laundresses of 1350 to ask their preferred method. We can only look at the evidence left behind and piece together the picture. You watch the woman scrub and wring out a simple linen tunic. It's a laborious process. The clothes are not gleaming white when she's finished. They're a kind of dull, off-white, and they'll likely still smell faintly of the stream, the wood smoke, and the cleaning agents used. There's a certain grim pragmatism to it all. It's about getting the worst of the dirt out, not about achieving a pristine, sanitized finish. You remember a callback to the previous section. The stream, which is used for drinking, is also used for washing. The cycle of contamination is on full display. The same water that cleans the clothes might be the source of a later illness. It's a constant, difficult paradox of medieval life. This lack of effective, modern laundry care also meant that clothing was a haven for pests. Lice, fleas, and other parasites would make their homes in the seams and folds of tunics and dresses. People knew this, and they would often hang their clothes out in the sun to try and kill the pests. But it was a constant battle. You feel a phantom itch on your scalp and shoulders, a new and unwelcome sensory detail that your mind is conjuring. The simple act of putting on a clean set of clothes is now transformed in your imagination. It's not just a matter of changing your outfit, it's a matter of managing the living. microscopic ecosystem that lives on your body and your clothes. And with that thought, you begin to appreciate the simple miracle of a washing machine and a bottle of detergent. With the mental image of urine-soaked tunics now firmly in your mind, your attention drifts upward, toward the head. Hair, in the Middle Ages, was a complicated matter. It wasn't just about style, it was about social status, religious piety, and, of course, hygiene. You look at the people passing by. Many of the men have long, shoulder-length hair, sometimes kept back with a simple leather tie. The women, especially those who are married, have their hair covered with a wimple or a veil. This isn't just for fashion, it's a form of modesty and practicality. A mainstream historical fact is that head lice were an almost universal problem. There was no chemical shampoo to kill them, so people had to rely on manual methods and herbal remedies. You remember the callback to the parasites you imagined on your clothes? They're here, too. A quirky tidbit is that medieval people used special fine-toothed combs, often made of bone or wood, to try and remove lice and nits. You can imagine a mother sitting by the hearth, patiently combing through her child's hair, picking out the tiny, crawling pests. It was a constant, tedious battle. They would also use herbal rinses made from things like lavender, rosemary, or wormwood, which were thought to repel the insects. The smell of these herbs, a welcome relief from the general stench, would have been a common scent in any household. Historians still argue whether the constant battle with lice was a sign of a lack of hygiene or simply an unavoidable part of life in an era with limited resources. Some scholars believe that the prevalence of head lice was simply a given, and people were well practiced in dealing with them. Others argue that it was a clear sign of poor sanitation and living conditions. The truth, again, is probably somewhere in the middle. The fact that they had specialized tools for the problem suggests it was a well-known, accepted part of their reality. They didn't see it as a moral failing, just a fact of life. You look at a small girl with a braid that's a little loose, and you can almost imagine the unseen creatures living within it. It's a sobering thought, but hair wasn't just a battleground for parasites, it was also a canvas for social expression. The length and style of a man's hair could signify his social class. Knights and noblemen would often wear their hair long, while peasants might keep it shorter for practicality. For women, especially unmarried women, long, flowing hair was a sign of beauty and virginity. Once married, covering the hair was a social and religious expectation. A woman walking with her hair uncovered in public was seen as immodest. You see a young woman, her hair braided and coiled at the back of her head, a simple linen wimple covering it. It's a look that's both practical and modest, a perfect reflection of the social norms of the time. And what about washing it? Remember our discussion of bathing. Hair was washed just as rarely as the rest of the body. They would use a mixture of water and herbs, or even a simple concoction of egg whites and water. The idea of a lathering, fragrant shampoo was, of course, an impossibility. The hair would have felt greasy, heavy, and would have had a certain odor, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and whatever herbs they used to try and clean it. The simple act of running your fingers through clean, dry hair is a quiet luxury that you've probably never truly appreciated, until now, as you walk on, you feel a faint urge to check your own head for any unwelcome guests. The phantom itch returns, stronger this time. It's a new kind of sensory experience, a historical one that reminds you just how different their lives were, with your mind now itching from the phantom lice and the smell of herbal rinses. You look to the most prominent feature of any face, the mouth. Oral hygiene in the Middle Ages was, unsurprisingly, very different from our modern routines of brushing twice a day with fluoridated toothpaste. A mainstream historical fact is that while they didn't have toothbrushes as we know them, medieval people did practice forms of oral care. The goal was less about fighting cavities and more about freshening the breath and removing visible food particles. You see a man gnawing on a piece of dried meat, and when he's finished, he uses a small twig to pick at his teeth. This was a common practice. These twigs, or chewing sticks, were often made from aromatic woods like hazel or willow and were used to clean the teeth and gums. A quirky tidbit that puts a fine point on it, some people would use abrasive powders made from crushed bones, dried herbs, or even pulverized charcoal to rub on their teeth. The idea was that the rough texture would scrape away the film and stains. It was, Of course, terrible for the enamel. But they didn't know that. They also chewed on fresh herbs like mint, parsley, or sage to mask bad breath. You can almost taste the bitter, earthy flavour of a sage leaf. It's a far cry from a minty fresh toothpaste. But it was a simple, practical solution to a persistent problem. You can see a young woman selling small bundles of these herbs in the market, her face a picture of serene resignation. This is her product, and it's in demand. Historians still argue whether medieval people suffered from more or fewer cavities than we do. On one hand, their diet was very low in sugar, which is the primary cause of modern cavities. On the other hand, their methods of oral hygiene were primitive, and their diet was often coarse and full of grit from stone-ground flour. Some scholars believe they had fewer cavities but suffered more from gum disease and tooth wear. Others suggest that the lack of sugar simply meant their dental issues were different, not necessarily better or worse. The truth is difficult to pin down without a lot of exhumed skeletons, and even then, the evidence is not always clear. You look at the people around you, and you notice that very few of them have perfect smiles. Many are missing teeth, and those that remain are often stained and worn. It's a physical manifestation of a life of hard work and limited resources. You see a group of travelling entertainers, their teeth a little whiter than the villagers. They might be using a concoction from a more skilled apothecary, or simply have better genetics. The point is, there was no universal standard of care. Your oral health was a direct reflection of your social standing and your personal habits. The rich might have access to better remedies and treatments, but for the average person, it was a daily battle to keep your mouth from feeling like a swamp. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we mentioned in a previous, completely different script? Well, the principle is the same here. People used what they had, and they often didn't know the long-term consequences. The use of abrasive powders might have whitened their teeth, but it also wore them down, leading to painful and eventually lost teeth later in life. There was no preventative care, no concept of long-term dental health. It was a day-by-day fight against the natural decay and wear of your own body. As you walk on, you can't help but run your tongue over your own teeth, a quiet, almost subconscious act of appreciation. The feeling of a smooth, clean surface is a luxury you'll never take for granted again. As you continue your immersive journey through the village, you notice a peculiar sign hanging outside a small wooden building, a striped pole, painted with alternating red and white bands, with a brass basin on top. This is the sign of the barber-surgeon. In the Middle Ages, the roles of a barber and a surgeon were not distinct. The same person who trimmed your hair might also pull your teeth or let your blood. A mainstream historical fact is that this was a common and accepted practice. The barber-surgeon was a hybrid professional, a jack of all trades when it came to the human body. You step closer and hear the low murmur of conversation and the faint clink of metal tools. Inside, you see a man in a leather apron, his hands stained with various pigments and fluids. He's not just giving a man a shave, he's also attending to a small wound on another person's arm, carefully applying a poultice. A quirky tidbit is that the red stripe on the barber pole symbolized blood, while the white stripe represented the bandages. The pole itself was where the patient would grip to steady themselves during a procedure. It's a grisly but practical visual aid. The brass basin at the top was where the leeches were kept, or where blood was collected. Historians still argue whether the barber-surgeon's dual role was a sign of medical progress or a testament to the primitive state of medicine. Some scholars believe that the barber-surgeons, who had practical experience with anatomy and tools, were often more skilled at surgical procedures than the academically trained physicians, who focused on theoretical medicine and the four humours. Others argue that their lack of formal training made their work dangerous and often led to more harm than good. You look at the tools hanging on the wall, crude knives, pliers, and other menacing-looking implements, and you can't help but feel a certain sense of dread. There was no anesthesia, no sterile environment, and no understanding of germs. A simple cut could be a death sentence. The barber-surgeon's skills were essential to daily life. He wasn't just the person you went to for a haircut, he was the person you went to for a toothache, a broken bone, or a troublesome boil. He was the local go-to for all manner of physical ailments. The services he provided were often painful and frightening, but they were a necessary part of life. You can imagine the fear and anticipation of a visit, the sound of the door closing behind you, the deep breath you would take before the procedure began. Remember the simple, everyday nature of waste disposal you saw earlier. The barber surgeon's shop was no exception. The discarded hair, the bloody bandages, the pulled teeth, all of it would be collected in a bucket and unceremoniously dumped outside. The lack of sanitation and hygiene in these medical procedures is a terrifying thought. The same unsterilized tools could be used from one patient to the next, unknowingly spreading disease. It's a powerful reminder that our modern medical practices, with their emphasis on cleanliness and sterilization, are the result of centuries of progress and a lot of trial and error. As you continue on your way, you feel a new appreciation for your own doctor and dentist, and you feel the phantom pinch of a leech's mouthparts on your own arm. The sensory details of this world are starting to feel uncomfortably real. After your unsettling visit to the barber surgeon, your focus shifts to something a little more personal: skincare. Today, we have a dizzying array of lotions, creams, and serums, but in the Middle Ages, things were much simpler and a lot greasier. You see a woman rubbing a thick, yellowish substance on her chapped hands. This is the extent of her moisturizing routine. A mainstream historical fact is that crude soaps, made from animal fats and lye, were used primarily for laundry and cleaning, not for bathing the body. When it came to personal care, the line between what was used for the home and what was used for the person was very blurry indeed. A quirky tidbit is that people often used rendered animal fats, like lard or tallow, to moisturize their skin. You can imagine the heavy, greasy feeling and the faint, savory smell that would have clung to them all day. They didn't have the concept of a lightweight moisturizer. The goal was simply to protect the skin from the elements, especially during the harsh winters. And animal fat was a readily available and effective barrier. They would also use herbal oils, infused with plants like marigold or lavender. But these were a luxury, a special treat for the wealthy. The average person's skin was constantly exposed to the sun, wind, and smoke from the hearth, and it was often chapped, red, and dry. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more or less prone to skin diseases than we are. Some scholars believe that the lack of modern hygiene and the constant exposure to germs meant they suffered more from infections, rashes, and sores. Others argue that their bodies were more resilient, having developed a stronger immunity to the bacteria in their environment. The truth is difficult to know, as the records are sparse. What we do know is that a simple cut or a rash could quickly become infected, as there were no antibiotics and little understanding of sterile care. The constant use of greasy animal fats, while good for moisturizing, could also clog pores and led to breakouts. It was a constant battle, a negotiation with a body that was under constant attack from the elements and a host of unseen enemies. You see a small child with a nasty-looking sore on his leg, and his mother is applying a poultice of herbs and possibly something more. There was no first aid kit to grab. Instead, people relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Some of these were surprisingly effective, like using honey for its antiseptic properties. Others were less so. Remember the barber surgeon and his unsterilized tools. That lack of cleanliness extended to every aspect of life. Even a simple application of a homemade remedy could be contaminated. It's a powerful reminder that every little thing, every cut, every scrape, was a potential life or death situation. This is a world where the idea of a glowing, blemish-free complexion is a fantasy. Everyone's skin tells a story of their life, of their work, of the illnesses they've survived. It's a canvas of a life lived outdoors, without protection, and without the benefit of modern science. As you walk on, you can't help but feel a little bit of gratitude for your own clean, pampered skin. It's a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the people around you. A clean, soft face wasn't a goal, it was a dream, with your skin feeling a phantom layer of tallow and your hair a little too greasy for your liking. You continue your journey, your nose on high alert. You're now in a narrow, winding lane, and the air is noticeably heavier. This brings you to the truly creative and often horrifying reality of medieval waste management. With no public services to collect garbage, every household was its own dump. A mainstream historical fact is that households would simply throw their refuse, or midden, into the street. This included everything from household scraps and ashes to broken pottery and animal bones. It all went out the door. into a communal pile that grew over time. You see a woman step out of a door with a large basket. She walks to the edge of the lane and simply upends it, sending a small cascade of garbage tumbling onto a pre-existing pile. A few chickens immediately begin to peck at the scraps. This is the simple, direct, and unsanitized method of garbage disposal. A quirky tidbit is that in larger towns, these piles of refuse would get so large they would sometimes impede traffic, and local ordinances were occasionally passed to force people to clean them up. But without a dedicated place to take the garbage, it was often a pointless exercise. The pile would simply grow somewhere else. The street was the city's trash can, a repository for everything that was no longer wanted inside the home. Historians still argue whether the practice of dumping waste in the streets was born of ignorance or sheer necessity. Some scholars believe that people simply didn't understand the health risks, and that the sheer volume of waste made any other solution impossible. Others argue that they had a basic understanding of cleanliness, but were so constrained by their lack of resources and public infrastructure that they had no other choice. The truth is likely a blend of both. They didn't have the concept of a landfill or a recycling program. The only solution was to let the waste decompose naturally, a process that, you can imagine, was not only slow but also incredibly smelly and unhygienic. This lack of waste management extended to waterways as well. We already touched on the rivers, but what about the smaller streams and ditches? You see a small, fetid stream running alongside the lane, and you notice a host of discarded objects floating in the murky water: a broken wooden bowl, a bit of cloth, and some rotting vegetables. This stream is not a source of clean water, it's a linear dump. A powerful callback is to the communal latrines we saw earlier, which often emptied directly into these waterways. The waste from the street and the waste from the body were all funneled into the same place, creating a powerful, interconnected web of filth. You can almost feel the presence of the flies and rats, the unofficial scavengers that thrive in this environment. They were a constant presence, a reminder that the human world and the animal world were deeply intertwined, and not in a cute Disney movie way. The simple act of walking down a street was a negotiation with this reality. You had to watch where you stepped, be mindful of what was above you, and try to ignore the smells. It's a powerful and humbling experience. You realize that the modern world's emphasis on clean streets, sealed trash cans, and sanitized public spaces is a luxury that has been hard-won over centuries of trial and error. Having walked through the streets and witnessed the creative, albeit unhygienic, methods of waste disposal, your senses are on high alert for anything that offers a cleaner alternative. Your eye catches a small, tidy garden behind a hut, filled not with vegetables, but with a variety of green plants. This brings us to a topic that was both a necessity and a form of everyday magic: herbal remedies. A mainstream historical fact is that before the advent of modern medicine, people relied almost exclusively on plants for their healing properties. Every village had someone, often a woman or a monk, who was skilled in the art of herbalism. They were the local pharmacists, the doctors, and the purveyors of hope. You see a woman carefully plucking a leaf from a plant with small, spiky leaves. It's likely comfrey, an herb known for its ability to heal wounds and soothe inflammation. A quirky tidbit is that people would make a poultice, a soft, moist mass of herbs, to apply directly to a wound. But they also used herbs in a variety of other ways, as infusions for internal ailments, as fragrant sachets to ward off bad smells, and as fumigants to cleanse the air. The concept of bad air or miasma was a powerful one, and people believed that fragrant herbs could drive away the unseen forces that caused sickness. This belief, while not scientifically accurate, led to the widespread use of things like lavender and rosemary, which have genuine antiseptic properties. Historians still argue whether medieval herbalism was more effective than not. Some scholars believe that many of the remedies were based on folklore and superstition, and that their effectiveness was more psychological than real. Others argue that, given the lack of alternatives, these remedies were surprisingly effective. Honey, for example, was used to clean wounds because of its natural antibacterial properties, a fact that modern science has confirmed. Willow bark, which contains salicin, was used to treat fevers and pain, a practice that led to the development of aspirin centuries later. The truth is that herbalism was a blend of practical knowledge, inherited wisdom, and a little bit of hopeful guesswork. You look at the plants in the garden and realize that each one is a little pharmacy, a repository of knowledge that has been passed down for generations. Remember the filthy streets and contaminated water we talked about? Herbal remedies were a direct response to this environment. The constant threat of infection and disease meant that every family had to have a basic understanding of what plants could be used for what. A simple scrape could turn deadly, so having a plant like comfrey or plantain nearby was a necessity. This self-reliance was a defining feature of medieval life. There was no hospital to go to, no 911 to call. You were your own first responder, and the natural world was your medicine cabinet. You feel a sense of profound respect for these people. They lived in a world where every single day was a battle for survival, and they used their wits and their knowledge of the natural world to fight back. They didn't have the technology or the scientific understanding we have, but they had a deep, practical knowledge that was born of necessity. As you walk on, you notice small pouches of herbs hanging from doorways, a silent prayer against the unseen forces of sickness. The scent is a welcome change from the rest of the village. A small pocket of fragrant, natural calm in a world of chaos. With the surprising effectiveness of herbal remedies fresh in your mind, your thoughts take a darker turn. All the filth, the contaminated water, and the lack of sanitation were not just inconveniences. They were an open invitation for something far more terrifying. This brings us to a grim, but necessary topic: the omnipresent threat of disease. A mainstream historical fact is that in the medieval world, pandemics were not just a possibility, they were an inevitability. The most famous, of course, is the Black Death. When it arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, it was a biological apocalypse. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread through fleas on rats, which were, as you've seen, everywhere. You feel a new kind of dread settle over you. The rats scuttling in the shadows now look less like simple pests and more like carriers of a terrifying, unseen killer. A quirky tidbit is that the plague doctor's uniform, with its long beak-like mask, wasn't created until much later. In the 17th century, the mask's beak was filled with fragrant herbs and spices, which the doctors believed would purify the miasma, or bad air, that they thought was the cause of the disease. This shows a complete misunderstanding of the actual transmission, but it was a practical solution that at least helped them endure the smells. You can almost see a phantom figure in a long cloak and that bird-like mask, a chilling symbol of a disease that defied understanding. Historians still argue whether the plague was truly a single event or a series of devastating outbreaks that recurred for centuries. Some scholars believe that the first wave in 1347 was the most brutal, and that later outbreaks were less severe as the population developed some immunity. Others argue that each wave was a new and terrifying event, and that the plague never truly left Europe for centuries. The debate highlights the difficulty of studying these ancient epidemics with our modern understanding of virology and bacteriology. What we do know is that the public health response was often a mix of superstition, religion, and practical, albeit ineffective, measures. You see a group of people gathered around a small shrine, their heads bowed in prayer. They believe the plague is divine punishment, a sign of God's wrath. This was a common belief, and it led to public displays of piety and religious processions, but it didn't stop the disease. More practical, though equally desperate, measures were also taken. You hear a bell ringing and see a man walking down the street, shouting, "Unclean, he is a leper," and he's required by law to announce his presence so that people can avoid him. This shows a basic understanding of contagion, but the scope of their knowledge was limited. The idea of quarantining a whole city, or even a house, was a difficult and often impossible task. The sheer scale of the death is hard to wrap your mind around. A mainstream historical fact is that the Black Death wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. The social, economic, and psychological impact was immense. The feudal system was broken, labour became scarce and valuable, and people's faith in authority, both religious and secular, was shattered. You feel the weight of this history in the air, a kind of historical quietness that belies the chaos. It's a powerful and humbling reminder of a world where life was so fragile, so susceptible to the whims of an invisible enemy. The hygiene you've seen, or lack thereof, was a small but significant, factor in this larger story of survival. With the heavy topic of the Black Death still lingering in the air, you instinctively find yourself looking for any sign of a better, cleaner life. You imagine what it would have been like for the wealthy, for the nobility. Surely they had a different experience, a more hygienic one. A mainstream historical fact is that while the upper classes had more resources, their approach to hygiene was still far from what we would consider clean. The nobility had access to more soap, more water, and private latrines, but they were not immune to the pervasive lack of sanitation. You imagine yourself in a grand castle. The air is still smoky from the hearth, but it's not as foul as the village. You're in a private chamber, where a servant is pouring water from a pitcher into a small, elegant basin. This is your washing station. A quirky tidbit is that the truly wealthy would sometimes have their water scented with rose petals or other fragrant herbs, and the basin might be made of silver or gold. The goal was not just to get clean, but to feel pampered and to project an image of wealth and refinement. The use of sweet-smelling substances was a way to mask the underlying body odor, a kind of primitive perfume. You remember the callback to the pomanders we talked about, a small ball of fragrant materials, often kept in a pouch or a decorative container that the wealthy would carry to ward off bad smells. It was a status symbol. Historians still argue whether the nobility had a better understanding of health and disease than the common folk. Some scholars believe that their access to a wider range of herbalists and physicians gave them a leg up, and that their cleaner living conditions led to better health outcomes. Others argue that their penchant for exotic, and often dangerous, cosmetics and their close intermingling with animals in the castle halls meant they were just as, if not more, susceptible to certain diseases. You think of the royal dogs and falcons living inside the castle walls, a constant source of fleas and other parasites. The truth is, their wealth and status bought them comfort and luxury, but it did not buy them immunity. You imagine a noblewoman's skincare routine. She might use a crude soap made of olive oil, but she would also use lead-based powders to whiten her face, a practice that was highly toxic. Remember our previous discussion of cosmetics. The desire to look beautiful often trumped the desire to be healthy. The idea was to appear pale and delicate, a sign that you didn't have to work in the sun like a common peasant. The irony is that this quest for beauty often led to terrible long-term health problems. You also think about the clothing. The nobles' clothes were made of fine silks and wool, and they were often cleaned by a specialized laundress, but they were still difficult to wash, and they were rarely changed. A single outfit could be worn for weeks or even months at a time, and a thick layer of grease and dirt would build up. The rich would also wear elaborate wigs, which were a haven for lice and other pests. So while they had a better surface-level hygiene, they were still dealing with the same fundamental problems as everyone else, just in a more elegant setting. As you move on, you realize that wealth could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy a germ-free existence. After imagining the gilded, yet still grubby, world of the nobility, you take a step back and look at the place where even they had to go, the privy. While the common folk used communal latrines or simply a pot, the wealthy had something a little more private. A mainstream historical fact is that in castles and manors, the toilet was often a simple stone shaft built into the wall. This shaft, known as a garderobe, would drop straight down into a moat or a cesspit. The name garderobe literally means wardrobe in French, a quirky tidbit that points to its secondary, and surprisingly effective, use. The ammonia from the waste would repel fleas and other insects, making it a good place to hang clothes to get rid of pests, a truly multi-purpose piece of architecture. You imagine a lord or a lady using this privy. It would be in a small, private room, often with a wooden seat over the hole. It was a step up from the communal latrines of the village, but it was still far from a pleasant experience. The draught coming up from the pit below would be considerable, and the smell would be a constant presence, a kind of low-level hum of unpleasantness. Historians still argue whether the garderobe was a sign of true sanitary progress or simply an architectural convenience that separated the classes. Some scholars believe that the private nature of the garderobe was a clear sign of the growing importance of personal privacy. Others argue that it was simply a more efficient way to deal with waste in a confined space like a castle, and that the health benefits were purely a matter of happenstance. You look at the walls of the imagined castle, and you can almost see the small, narrow slits in the stone, the telltale sign of a garderobe. It's a sobering thought that even in a place of great power and wealth, the most basic bodily functions were still dealt with in a way that seems, to our modern minds, incredibly crude. Remember the village street and the cesspits? The guardrobe was just a more direct way of getting the waste to the same place. And the cesspit still had to be emptied by hand. A job for the lowest of the low. The reality is that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could escape the fundamental realities of their world. There were no sealed pipes, no water treatment plants. Everything was a part of a single, interconnected, and often filthy ecosystem. The lord in his castle and the peasant in his hut were both subject to the same laws of nature, the same threat of disease. The castle's moat, which might look beautiful in a painting, was also a glorified sewer. The gardens, which were so carefully tended, might be fertilized with the same night soil that was dumped on the street. This realization brings you back to a central theme of our journey, the constant, and often losing, battle for cleanliness in the face of overwhelming odds. The toilet, in its most basic form, is a perfect symbol of this. It's a necessity, but it's a problem that had to be solved in the most pragmatic way possible, with little regard for comfort or long-term health. The concept of a modern bathroom, a clean, private, and sanitary space, is a testament to centuries of engineering, scientific discovery, and a fundamental shift in our understanding of what it means to be truly clean. Having contemplated the aristocratic guardrobe and its connection to the cesspit, your mind is now free to make a fascinating and often surprising historical leap. You're no longer in the 14th century, but centuries later, in the bustling, smoggy heart of Victorian London. This is a powerful callback to show just how long it took to solve the problems you've been observing. A mainstream historical fact is that even as late as the 19th century, London's waste management was a public health disaster. The city's primary sewer was the River Thames, which was also the source of much of its drinking water. The result was a catastrophic public health crisis. You can almost smell it now. A new and different kind of foulness. It's the Great Stink of 1858. A quirky tidbit is that the summer of 1858 was unusually hot, and the low water levels in the Thames exposed vast banks of festering sewage. The smell was so overwhelming that it was said to stop traffic, and members of Parliament were so incapacitated by the stench that they had to hold handkerchiefs to their noses. The river was, to put it mildly, a giant open sewer. The government offices, which were located right on the banks of the Thames, were at the epicenter of this olfactory assault. It was a crisis that couldn't be ignored. Historians still argue whether the Great Stink was the primary motivator for public health reform or simply the last straw. Some scholars believe that the sheer scale of the problem and the fact that it affected the powerful and the wealthy was the final push needed to enact change. Others argue that the groundwork for public health reform had already been laid by figures like Edwin Chadwick and Dr. John Snow, who was the first to link cholera to contaminated water from a single water pump. The truth is that it was a combination of these factors. The Great Stink was the moment the problem became too big to be swept under the rug. You think about the medieval village and its fetid stream, and you realize that the same fundamental problem was still a part of life, just on a much, much larger scale. The people of London were still dumping their waste into their drinking water. It took centuries for us to figure out a better way, and it wasn't a matter of simple invention, it was a matter of political will, scientific discovery, and a massive investment in public works. The Great Stink led to the construction of a modern sewer system in London, a masterpiece of Victorian engineering that is still in use today. The chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, was a true hero of hygiene, creating an underground network of pipes that carried the city's waste away from the river and out to the sea. This is a powerful and humbling story. It shows that the problems of the Middle Ages weren't just a matter of primitive technology, they were a matter of a fundamental misunderstanding of the world around us. And it took a truly catastrophic event, a smell so bad it was literally a political crisis, to finally force a change. As you return your mind's eye to the medieval world, you now see its filth not as a strange and alien thing, but as a smaller, more intimate version of a problem that plagued humanity for centuries. The story of hygiene isn't a straight line of progress. It's a long, winding, and often incredibly smelly road, with the Great Stink a distant, powerful memory. You find yourself back in the medieval village. You've seen the filth of the streets and the unglamorous reality of castle sanitation. And now you're thinking about those Roman baths you remember from a historical documentary. Did they exist here, in a medieval context? The answer is yes. But with a major caveat. A mainstream historical fact is that public baths, or stews, as they were sometimes called, did exist in many medieval towns. But they were not the grand, hygienic institutions of the Roman world. You imagine stepping into a medieval bathhouse. It's a simple stone or wooden building with a large tub or two in the centre, heated by a fire. The water is murky. A communal soup that is used by multiple people. A quirky tidbit is that these bathhouses were not just for getting clean, they were also major social hubs. People would go to the baths to socialise, to gossip, to eat, and even to conduct business. It was a place to see and be seen. A social event as much as a hygienic one. This communal aspect, however, also made them a hotbed for disease. You can almost feel the unsanitized with shared water on your skin, and the thought is deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether the medieval bathhouses contributed to the spread of disease, especially sexually transmitted ones. Some scholars believe that the close proximity of people in the baths, and the often lax social atmosphere, led to a rise in certain illnesses. Others argue that the health benefits of washing, even in dirty water, outweighed the risks, and that the baths were a crucial part of medieval health and social life. The truth is difficult to pin down. The very same thing that made the baths a place for relaxation and socializing also made them a potential breeding ground for pathogens. You see a group of men sitting in the tub, their conversation a low rumble. They are playing a game of dice, their bodies submerged in the communal water. A servant is pouring in more hot water from a bucket, adding to the steam and the murkiness. This is not the clean, solitary experience of a modern spa. This is a communal, slightly gross, and entirely normal part of their lives. A callback to the earlier section about bathing. Remember how it was a rare luxury for most people. A visit to the public bathhouse was their only chance for a full-body wash, and it was a special occasion. The existence of these bathhouses also points to a philosophical divide. On one hand, people understood the importance of washing away the grime of daily life. On the other hand, they had a fundamental lack of understanding of germs and contagion. This is a constant theme in our journey. The paradox of knowing something is dirty without understanding why it is dangerous. The bathhouse was a perfect example of this. It was a place for cleanliness, but it was also a place where you could easily get sick. The simple act of entering a bathhouse was a risk, a trade-off between the immediate feeling of being clean and the unseen, long-term health consequences. As you walk away, the sound of laughter from inside the bathhouse seems to mock your modern sensibilities. After the slightly unsettling reality of the public bathhouse, you find yourself seeking a place of order, a place where cleanliness might be more than a social event. This leads you to the gates of a monastery. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries were often a beacon of cleanliness and organization in the Middle Ages. While the rest of the world was struggling with waste and disease, the monastic orders had a more structured and disciplined approach to hygiene. You imagine stepping inside the high walls. The air is noticeably cleaner, smelling of beeswax and old stone, not manure and open sewers. The monks had a practical and religious reason for their cleanliness. The Benedictine rule, a guide for monastic life, included provisions for washing. It was seen as a way to maintain health and to honor God. A quirky tidbit is that monasteries often had complex systems for managing water. They would divert streams to run through the monastery, creating a kind of medieval plumbing system that served the kitchens and the infirmary and the latrines. The latrines, or reredatas, were often built over a fast-flowing stream, a much more hygienic solution than the cesspits of the village. Historians still argue whether the monastic model of hygiene had a significant impact on the rest of society. Some scholars believe that the monks' knowledge was kept within the monastery walls and was not widely shared. Others argue that the monasteries served as a kind of hygienic model, and that their practices eventually influenced the public at large. The truth is likely a blend of both. They were certainly more advanced than the average village, but their resources and knowledge were not easily transferable. You see a monk washing his hands in a stone basin, the water flowing from a small spout. This simple, yet profound, act of hand-washing was a part of their daily routine, a ritual that was both practical and spiritual. Remember the communal water sources of the village? Here, the water is managed, a precious resource that is used with care and purpose. The monks' robes are simple, but they are clean. A testament to the monastery's organized life, their food preparation was also more hygienic. The kitchens had separate areas for cleaning and cooking, and the monks were meticulous about washing their hands and their utensils. This was a place where order, discipline, and a respect for both the physical and the spiritual world came together to create a life that was, by medieval standards, incredibly clean. This is a powerful contrast to the world you've been exploring. The monastery represents a different path, a different way of living. It shows that the knowledge of how to create a more hygienic environment was not entirely lost. It was simply confined to a few pockets of civilization. It reminds you that history is not a single, monolithic story. There are always exceptions, always alternative paths. As you walk out of the monastery gates and back into the familiar smells of the village, you feel a new appreciation for the hard-won cleanliness of your own world. The simple sight of a clean, flowing stream is now a symbol of order and health. Leaving the relative cleanliness of the monastery, you are once again confronted by the realities of village life. You've seen the filth and the lack of sanitation, but there are small, simple rituals that stand out as a testament to people's desire to be clean. This brings us to a simple, yet crucial act that was a part of daily life, the hand-washing bowl. A mainstream historical fact is that while full-body bathing was rare, the washing of hands and face was a much more common practice, especially before a meal. It was not just about cleanliness, it was a ritual of hospitality and etiquette. You see a small group of people gathered at a table for a meal before they begin to eat. A young boy brings a pitcher of water and a small basin, and he pours a thin stream of water over each person's hands. A quirky tidbit is that this act, known as a ewery, was a formal ritual, especially in noble households. The servant in charge of this duty was called the ewerer, and the equipment, the basin and pitcher, were often made of precious metals in wealthy homes. For the common folk, it was a much simpler affair, often just a shared basin and a single pitcher, but the act was the same, a moment of shared, communal cleanliness. Historians still argue whether this practice had a significant impact on public health. Some scholars believe that the simple act of washing hands, even with contaminated water, helped to remove some of the most harmful surface germs and contributed to a lower incidence of certain diseases. Others argue that it was purely a social ritual, and that its health benefits were minimal. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While it wasn't a modern surgical scrub, it was a practical and symbolic act that represented a desire to be clean before eating. It was a small but important step toward a better understanding of hygiene. Remember the communal nature of so much of medieval life. The latrine, the bathhouse, the hand-washing bowl was another example of this. It was a shared resource, a communal act that brought people together. You can imagine the low murmur of conversation as the water is poured, the feeling of the cool water on your hands, the simple, tangible feeling of the day's grime being washed away. The water was likely not as clean as we'd like, but the act itself was a powerful one. It was a way of separating the dirty, working world from the clean, domestic world of the meal. This simple act of hand-washing is a powerful callback to our own modern world. The importance of hand-washing, which we've relearned so many times throughout history, was something they understood, even if they didn't know the science behind it. It was a part of their daily routine, a small moment of cleanliness in a world that was often overwhelmingly dirty. The simple sight of the water pouring from the pitcher is a powerful symbol of this. It's a reminder that even in the most unhygienic of times, people still had a desire to be clean. It's a testament to the human spirit and a little bit of common sense. With the simple ritual of hand-washing now a familiar sight, your nose is once again on high alert. You've noticed that while the general atmosphere of the village is, to put it mildly, pungent, there are moments of relief. This brings us to a topic of a more fragrant nature, body odor and how people dealt with it. A mainstream historical fact is that because bathing was a rare event, and laundry was such a chore, body odor was a constant and accepted part of life. People didn't try to eliminate it, they tried to mask it. You see a young woman discreetly pulling a small and fragrant ball from her sleeve. This is a pomander. A quirky tidbit is that these pomanders were not just for the wealthy, they were simple balls of fragrant materials like dried herbs, spices, or scented waxes, and they were a common tool for dealing with the smells of daily life. The wealthy had them made of gold or silver and filled with exotic spices like civet or ambergris. The common folk had a simple cloth pouch filled with rosemary, lavender, or thyme. The scent was not meant to perfume the person, it was meant to provide a small, personal bubble of clean air. You can almost smell the strong, earthy scent of the dried herbs, a stark contrast to the surrounding atmosphere. Historians still argue whether the use of these masking agents was a sign of a society that had simply given up on cleanliness or a pragmatic response to a problem they couldn't solve. Some scholars believe that the use of pomanders and other perfumes was a clear indication that people were aware of their own body odor and sought to cover it up. Others argue that it was a purely social and status-driven behavior, and that the smell of a person was an accepted part of their identity. The truth is likely a mix of both. They had a basic understanding of what smells were pleasant and what were not, but they lacked the tools to create a truly clean body. So they did the next best thing. They created a fragrant illusion. You think about the callback to the nobles and their elaborate, scented waters. The principle is the same here, just on a much smaller scale. The desire to smell good is a very human one, and it's something that transcends social class. It was a small act of rebellion against the realities of a world without soap and deodorant. You see an old man sitting on a bench, and he is wearing a small sprig of rosemary pinned to his tunic. It's a simple and rather charming detail that speaks volumes. It's a small sign of his personal pride, a way of saying, I may be old and poor, but I still care. This is a world where scents are everything. The smell of the street, the smell of the fire, the smell of the people. It all tells a story. And the use of perfumes and herbs was a way of writing a small, pleasant chapter in that story. It was a form of self-expression, a way of asserting a small bit of control over an environment that was often chaotic and dirty. The simple act of smelling something nice was a luxury. As you walk on, you can't help but feel a little bit of gratitude for your own modern-day deodorant. It's not just a product, it's a silent testament to centuries of progress. A quiet victory in the long, and often smelly, war against body odor. Your olfactory journey through the Middle Ages continues, but this time, you're looking at something a little more personal and, for some, a lot more dangerous: cosmetics. A mainstream historical fact is that people, especially the wealthy, used various products to enhance their appearance, and many of these were made with highly toxic ingredients. The goal was often to achieve a specific look: pale, ethereal skin and rosy cheeks, that was seen as a sign of high status and a life free from manual labor in the sun. You see a noblewoman's dressing table, and it's a mix of herbs and something much more sinister. A quirky tidbit is that lead was a common ingredient in face paints. White lead, or ceruse, was a very popular base for whitening the skin. It created a beautifully pale complexion, but it was incredibly poisonous. Over time, it would cause hair loss, skin damage, and eventually lead poisoning, which could lead to death. The woman applying the paint has no idea that she is slowly killing herself in the name of beauty. They also used other dangerous substances like mercury and arsenic. Remember our earlier discussion of the four humours? They believed that a pale complexion was a sign of a balanced temperament, and so they were willing to risk their health to achieve it. Historians still argue whether the use of these poisonous cosmetics was a sign of vanity or simply a lack of scientific knowledge. Some scholars believe that people were so desperate to achieve a certain look that they were willing to take the risk, even if they had a basic understanding of the dangers. Others argue that they had no idea of the long-term consequences and believed that the products were simply a part of their beauty routine, no more dangerous than a simple face cream. The truth is likely a blend of both. They saw the short-term benefits, a smooth, pale complexion, and were willing to ignore the potential long-term risks. You look at a painting of a medieval noblewoman. She looks serene and beautiful, but you now see her differently. You see the signs of a body under constant attack. Her hair is thinning from the lead, her skin is scarred from the mercury, and she likely suffers from the internal symptoms of poisoning. It's a sobering thought that the very things that made her beautiful to her contemporaries were slowly and silently killing her. The makeup was not just a cosmetic, it was a status symbol, a sign of her willingness to risk everything for the sake of her appearance. This is a powerful callback to the crude remedies and medical practices you've seen. The lack of scientific understanding wasn't limited to medicine, it extended to every aspect of life. They were a society of trial and error, of folk wisdom and inherited knowledge, and this often led to unintended and tragic consequences. The idea of a government agency regulating cosmetics or a company listing ingredients on a label is a fantasy, a futuristic concept that would be impossible to imagine. As you turn away from the dressing table, you can't help but feel a certain sense of pity for the people who lived in this era. They were so earnest in their pursuit of beauty, and they paid such a terrible price for it. After considering the dangerous world of medieval cosmetics, your thoughts shift to the people who were supposed to be the experts on the human body, the physicians. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was not based on science as we know it, but on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours. This theory, which dated back to Hippocrates and Galen, posited that the human body was made up of four cardinal fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of balance between these humours, and disease was a sign of an imbalance. You imagine a medieval physician, not in a lab coat, but in a long robe, poring over a manuscript. He is not looking for a virus or a bacteria, he is looking for a way to restore balance. A quirky tidbit is that each humour was associated with a specific temperament, an organ, a season, and a classical element. Blood was linked to the liver, spring, and air, and a sanguine, optimistic personality. Yellow bile was linked to the spleen, summer, and fire, and a choleric, irritable personality. Black bile was linked to the gallbladder, autumn, and earth, and a melancholic, sad personality. Phlegm was linked to the brain and lungs, winter, and water, and a phlegmatic, calm personality. This was their entire model of the body. A complex but ultimately flawed system. Historians still argue whether the humour theory was a hindrance or a help to medical progress. Some scholars believe that it was so ingrained in medical thought that it prevented people from looking for the real causes of disease. Others argue that it provided a framework for understanding the body, and that it was a step toward a more systematic approach to medicine. The truth is that it was both. It was a lens through which they saw the world, and it was a lens that was often clouded by superstition and a lack of real knowledge. This is a powerful callback to the crude medical practices you've seen, like bloodletting and the use of leeches, which we'll discuss in more detail later. These practices were not random, they were a direct and logical consequence of the humour theory. If you had an excess of blood, the solution was to get rid of it. Simple, right? You think about a patient going to a physician. The physician would not ask about their diet or their exposure to germs. He would ask about their temperament, their dreams, and the colour of their urine. The diagnosis would be based on these signs, not on a physical examination in the way we know it. The treatment would be aimed at restoring the balance of the humours through a specific diet, herbal remedies, or, most commonly, bloodletting. The idea of a microbe, an invisible, living thing causing a disease, was completely alien to them. Their world was one of visible forces and tangible imbalances. As you walk on, you feel a renewed sense of gratitude for the advancements of modern medicine, and a faint shiver of dread at the thought of a medieval doctor with a scalpel in his hand. After exploring the theoretical world of the four humours, you're now faced with the hard, practical realities of life, and there are few things more fundamental, or more dangerous, than childbirth. A mainstream historical fact is that childbirth in the Middle Ages was a perilous event for both mother and child. Without any understanding of germ theory, the conditions were incredibly unhygienic, and the mortality rates were tragically high. You find yourself in a small, cramped hut where a woman is in labour. The room is dark and filled with the acrid smell of sweat and fear. The midwife, a local woman with no formal medical training, is there to help. There is no concept of a sterile environment. The bed linens are old and unwashed. The water used to clean the mother is likely contaminated, and the midwife's hands, though she may have washed them in a perfunctory way, are full of the day's grime. A quirky tidbit is that midwives would often use herbal concoctions to help with the pain or to try and induce labour. These remedies were passed down through generations, and their effectiveness was a mix of folk wisdom and pure chance. They also used charms, spells, and prayers, believing that the outcome was as much a matter of divine will as it was of physical reality. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates were primarily due to a lack of hygiene or to the physical challenges of childbirth itself. Some scholars believe that the prevalence of puerperal fever, or childbed fever, was a direct result of the unhygienic conditions and the lack of sanitation. Others argue that the physical difficulty of giving birth, especially for women who were often malnourished and overworked, was the primary cause of death. The truth is likely a combination of these factors. You can feel the tension in the room, the sense that this is a life or death moment, and that all the hopes and prayers in the world might not be enough. The mother's pain is raw and unmediated. There is no epidural, no C-section, just a quiet hope that the body will be strong enough. Remember the barber surgeon and his unsterilized tools, the midwife's tools, if she had any, would be no better. A simple piece of twine used to tie the umbilical cord could be a carrier of a deadly infection. The smallest cut, the simplest tear, could lead to a sepsis that would kill the mother in a matter of days. The baby, too, was at risk. The infant mortality rate was incredibly high, with many children not surviving their first year. The lack of proper nutrition, the exposure to germs, and the general fragility of life made every newborn's existence a gamble. This is a powerful and humbling chapter in our journey. It reminds us that our modern medical care, with its emphasis on sanitation, sterile equipment, and trained professionals, is a hard-won victory. The simple act of giving birth, which we now think of as a medical procedure, was once a terrifying rite of passage, a moment when the line between life and death was dangerously thin. The silence in the hut, broken only by the mother's grunts and the midwife's soft words, is a powerful and somber reminder of a world where life was both a miracle and a terrifying risk. With the solemn thought of childbirth lingering in your mind, your attention is drawn to the broader landscape of sickness. A mainstream historical fact is that in the medieval world, disease was not just a physical ailment, it was also a spiritual and moral one. People's understanding of illness was a fascinating blend of practical folk remedies and deep-seated religious superstition. When someone fell ill, it was common to attribute the sickness to a variety of causes: a divine punishment for a sin, the malevolent work of a witch, or the influence of a bad spirit. You see a small group of villagers gathered around a sick child, and they are not just applying herbal poultices, they are also whispering prayers and placing a small, carved wooden cross under his pillow. This blend of the spiritual and the practical was a constant in medieval life. A quirky tidbit is that people would often carry small amulets or relics of saints to protect themselves from disease. They believed that these items, imbued with a divine power, could ward off sickness. You can almost feel the smooth, worn surface of a small stone amulet, carried for years in a pocket or on a string around the neck, a quiet plea for protection. Historians still argue whether this reliance on superstition hindered or helped medical progress. Some scholars believe that it created a fatalistic worldview that discouraged people from seeking practical solutions to their health problems. Others argue that it provided a sense of hope and comfort in a world where there were no real medical answers. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was a way of making sense of a world that was often terrifying and incomprehensible. When a plague swept through a village, people didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand it, so they turned to the only thing they had, their faith. Remember the four humours? That was the scientific explanation. But for the average person, the reason for sickness was often much simpler and more personal. A bad harvest was a sign of God's displeasure. A fever was the result of a cursed stare. This is a world where the lines between science, magic, and religion were incredibly blurry. The same person who gave you an herbal remedy might also give you a charm to wear around your neck. You see a woman tying a red thread around her child's wrist, a folk remedy believed to ward off evil spirits. It's a simple and rather beautiful act of a mother trying to protect her child with the tools she has available. This reliance on superstition and faith was not a sign of ignorance, it was a sign of desperation. They lived in a world where disease was a constant threat, and they had to use every tool at their disposal, physical, spiritual, and magical, to fight back. The silence in the sick room, broken only by the low murmur of prayer, is a powerful reminder of this. It's a world where you had to believe in something, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. As you walk on, you feel a new appreciation for the clarity of our own scientific understanding, a quiet gratitude for a world where we can fight disease with medicine, not just with prayer. After observing the mix of medicine and superstition in the village, your perspective now widens. You've been in a bustling town, but what about the people who lived far from the communal cesspits and public latrines? A mainstream historical fact is that hygiene practices were vastly different between urban and rural life. While towns were a breeding ground for disease due to their high density and communal filth, the countryside offered a different set of challenges and opportunities. You imagine yourself on a quiet farm, the air smelling of fresh earth and hay. There is no communal well, no public latrine, and no refuse piles in the street. A quirky tidbit is that in rural areas, waste disposal was often a more integrated part of the agricultural cycle. Human and animal waste was used as fertilizer for crops, a practice that, while still unhygienic, had a purpose and a system. The waste was not just left to rot, it was put to use. This created a different, and in some ways more sustainable ecosystem. You see a farmer spreading manure on his fields, a process that is smelly and dirty, but which is also essential to his livelihood. It's a powerful and pragmatic contrast to the simple dumping of waste in a town. Historians still argue whether rural life was healthier than urban life. Some scholars believe that the lower population density and the more dispersed waste made the countryside a healthier place to live. Others argue that the lack of access to trained physicians and the more isolated nature of life meant that rural folk were just as, if not more, susceptible to disease and injury. The truth is likely a blend of both. They were not immune to the same diseases that plagued the towns, but the spread of those diseases would have been much slower. They might not have had a doctor to go to, but they also didn't have to worry about drinking from a contaminated public well. Remember the filthy streets of the village? Here, the street is a simple dirt path. There are no refuse piles, no open sewers. The waste is integrated into the land. This is a world where nature's systems of decomposition and renewal are on full display. The same water that runs from a small stream might be the source of their drinking water, but it's less likely to be contaminated by the waste of thousands of people. The simple act of living in a less crowded environment was, in and of itself, a form of hygiene. However, rural life also had its own unique set of problems. The close proximity of people to their livestock was a constant source of parasites and disease. The lack of a communal latrine meant that waste was often left in the open, a breeding ground for flies and other pests, and a single illness could be devastating, as there was no one to turn to for help. The life of a rural peasant was one of self-reliance, of living by the laws of nature. It was a simpler life, but it was not necessarily a cleaner one. It was a different kind of dirty. As you walk on, you feel a renewed appreciation for the modern world's ability to live in a clean environment, regardless of whether it's in a city or the country. From the countryside and its integrated waste systems, you find yourself back in a small, cramped urban home. There's no outdoor privy and no running water. This brings you to a simple, yet essential, piece of medieval furniture, the communal chamber pot. A mainstream historical fact is that for many people, especially those living in tenements or small apartments, the chamber pot was the primary, and often only, toilet. It was a simple ceramic or wooden pot, and it was a staple of every household. You imagine a family of 5 living in a single room. There is no private bathroom, no sense of personal space. A quirky tidbit is that the chamber pot was often a shared resource. The whole family would use the same pot throughout the night, and in the morning, the contents would be emptied, often unceremoniously, into the street. A callback to our first section, remember that woman who tossed the slop from her window? It was likely the contents of a chamber pot. The sound of a splash in the street below was a familiar part of the morning rhythm. Historians still argue whether the use of communal chamber pots contributed more to disease than public latrines. Some scholars believe that the close proximity of the pot to the living space and the lack of proper disposal created a constant source of germs and foul odors. Others argue that it was simply a more private and therefore more dignified solution than a public latrine. The truth is likely that it was a combination of both. It was a pragmatic solution to a problem that had no easy answer. It was better than using a corner of the room, but it was still a breeding ground for bacteria and a constant source of discomfort. You think about the family who used the pot. The father would use it, then the mother, and then the children. The contents would accumulate throughout the night, and by morning, the smell would be overwhelming. The simple act of using the pot was a negotiation with your senses, a moment of profound and often unpleasant, intimacy. The pot was not just a toilet, it was a symbol of the close, and often unsanitized. Nature of medieval family life. There was no escape from the smells and the sounds of your family, no private moment to be had. This reliance on the chamber pot also had social consequences. The people who were tasked with emptying them, the gong farmers we mentioned earlier, were on the lowest rung of the social ladder. It was a thankless, smelly job, but it was essential to the functioning of the town. The pot was a visible sign of the class divide. A reminder that while the lord in his castle had a guard-robe, the common person had a simple pot that they had to empty by hand. The simple act of going to the bathroom is now a microcosm of medieval life. It was public, it was smelly, and it was a constant reminder of your place in the world. With the image of the communal chamber pot still fresh in your mind, your attention now shifts to a more pleasant, yet still unhygienic, part of daily life, feasting and table manners. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, the way people ate was very different from our modern use of forks, knives, and spoons. The primary utensils were your fingers, and table manners were a complex set of rules for a world without personal plates or cutlery. You imagine a long table, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, bread, and flagons of ale. There are no individual plates. Instead, a large, thick slice of bread, called a trencher, serves as a plate for multiple people. A quirky tidbit is that after the meal, the food-soaked trencher was either eaten, given to the poor, or fed to the dogs. It was a resourceful, and surprisingly efficient, way to manage waste. You see a man dipping a piece of bread into a communal stew, and then he simply uses his fingers to pull a piece of meat from the roasted chicken. The idea of double dipping was not a thing, it was simply how people ate. Historians still argue whether this communal eating style was a sign of a more close-knit society or simply a matter of practicality. Some scholars believe that the shared trencher and the use of fingers fostered a sense of community and trust. Others argue that it was a clear sign of the lack of sanitation and the prevalence of disease. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was a way of eating that was born of necessity. Forks were a rare luxury, and individual plates were not common. The rules of etiquette that did exist were focused on managing this communal experience. For example, it was considered good manners to use only 3 fingers to eat, and it was a sign of a slovenly person to eat with the whole hand. You look at the people around the table, and you can almost feel the intimacy and the danger of this shared meal. Remember the hand-washing bowl from a previous section. The ewery ritual before the meal was crucial because of this. You were about to eat with your hands from a communal platter, so a quick wash was a necessity. This is a powerful callback to the paradox of medieval life. They knew they were dirty, so they created rituals to manage the dirt. They couldn't eliminate the problem, so they created a set of rules to deal with it. This reliance on manners and rituals, rather than sanitation, was a defining feature of their approach to hygiene. The leftovers, too, had their own story. What wasn't given to the dogs was often thrown to the poor, who would wait outside the castle gates for the scraps. This was a system of social welfare that was both pragmatic and deeply unhygienic. The food that was handled by many, and was often spoiled, was then given to the most vulnerable people in society. It's a sobering thought. The simple act of eating is now transformed in your mind. It's not just a matter of nourishment, it's a complex dance of social rules, hygienic risks, and a constant negotiation with the realities of a world without modern conveniences. Having explored the unhygienic realities of medieval dining, your thoughts return to the public bathhouse, but this time, you'll go inside. You've heard about the social aspect, but what was the actual experience like? A mainstream historical fact is that a trip to the bathhouse was a well-established routine in many urban centres, and it often involved a series of different tubs and rooms. You imagine stepping into the bathhouse. The air is thick with steam and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. You are led to a large room where a series of tubs, some small, some large enough for a group, are filled with hot water. A quirky tidbit is that people often brought their own food and drink to the bathhouse. It was a place to unwind, to socialize, and to indulge. You can almost hear the laughter and the low murmur of conversation as people relax in the warm water. There are no individual showers, no private stalls. It's all out in the open. A truly communal experience. This is a powerful callback to the communal latrines you saw earlier. The medieval world was not one of personal privacy. Historians still argue whether the bathhouses' decline was due to moral or public health concerns. Some scholars believe that the spread of syphilis and other diseases, which was blamed on the bathhouses, led to their eventual closure. Others argue that it was a combination of religious disapproval and the general economic decline that made the maintenance of these public spaces too difficult. The truth is that the bathhouse was a microcosm of medieval life. It was a place of comfort and community, but it was also a place of risk. The same water that soothed your muscles and washed away the day's grime could also be the source of a deadly infection. You see a group of men sitting in a tub, and a servant is pouring in more hot water from a bucket. They are not just sitting there, they are scrubbing themselves with coarse cloths and a little bit of crude soap. This is their weekly, or perhaps monthly, ritual. The water is murky, a testament to how many people have used it. The bathhouse was a place of luxury, a place to escape the dirt and grime of the street, but it was also a place where you were exposed to the dirt of others. The simple act of entering the water was a negotiation with this reality. You were trading the dirt of the street for the dirt of your fellow man, and you were hoping that the trade was worth it. You also see a small, cold tub in a corner. This was for a quick, shocking plunge after the hot bath, a practice that was believed to be good for the humours. You remember our discussion of the 4 humours and their balance. The hot bath would make you sanguine, and the cold plunge would restore the balance. The medieval world was one of extremes, and their approach to hygiene was no different. It was a mix of ritual, belief, and a little bit of common sense. The simple act of taking a bath is now a complex story of a society trying to be clean in a world that was determined to be dirty. After the sensory overload of the bathhouse, you find yourself seeking a different kind of solace. This leads you to a small chapel, a place where the physical world is meant to take a back seat to the spiritual. This brings us to a fascinating and often overlooked part of medieval life, the role of saints and relics in healing and cleanliness. A mainstream historical fact is that in a world without modern medicine, people often turned to saints for protection and healing. They believed that these holy figures, who were believed to be closer to God, could intercede on their behalf. You see a small, rough-hewn statue of Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of plague victims. His body is pierced with arrows, a powerful symbol of the suffering and the hope for a miraculous recovery. People would come to the chapel to pray to him, to leave offerings, and to touch a small relic, a piece of bone or a bit of cloth that was believed to have belonged to him. A quirky tidbit is that these relics were so valuable that a vast, unregulated market for them emerged. Many of them were fake, but that didn't matter to the people who believed in their power. You can almost feel the smooth, worn surface of a small stone that a woman is clutching in her hand, a silent prayer for her sick child. Historians still argue whether this reliance on saints and relics was a sign of a society's desperate grasp for hope or a form of passive resistance to the realities of a world without medical answers. Some scholars believe that it was a clear sign of the lack of scientific knowledge and the prevalence of superstition. Others argue that it was a psychological coping mechanism, a way of dealing with a world that was often terrifying and incomprehensible. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was a way of making sense of a world where disease seemed to strike at random. Remember the reliance on folk remedies and superstitions you saw earlier? The use of saints and relics was a higher-level version of the same thing. It was a way of fighting back against an enemy you couldn't see and couldn't understand. The silence in the chapel, broken only by the soft whisper of prayer, is a powerful reminder of this. It's a world where you had to believe in something, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. This reliance on faith also had an impact on the idea of cleanliness. A pilgrimage to a holy site, or a visit to a shrine, was seen as a way of cleansing not just the soul, but also the body. The journey itself, the hardship, and the physical act of penance were a way of purifying yourself. This is a powerful and interesting contrast to our modern idea of cleanliness, which is almost entirely physical. For them, cleanliness was a spiritual and moral state as much as a physical one. As you walk out of the chapel and back into the bustle of the village, you realize that for many people, the path to cleanliness was not through a bathhouse, but through a prayer. Leaving the quiet piety of the chapel, you're now thinking about the people who didn't stay in one place. What about the pilgrims, the merchants, the soldiers? What was hygiene like for those on the move? A mainstream historical fact is that staying clean while traveling was an almost impossible task. The road was a constant source of dirt, and the resources for washing were few and far between. You imagine yourself on the road, your clothes covered in a fine layer of dust and your skin feeling grimy. A quirky tidbit is that travelers would often carry a small piece of cloth and a bit of a simple, harsh soap to try and wash their hands and face, but a full-body wash was an impossibility. You would simply get dirtier and dirtier as the journey went on. The inns and taverns you would stop at were no better. They were often cramped, unhygienic, and filled with fleas and other pests. You can almost feel the phantom itch of a flea bite, a new and unwelcome companion on your journey. Historians still argue whether the lack of hygiene on the road contributed to a faster spread of disease. Some scholars believe that the constant movement of people, and their unhygienic state, was a major factor in the spread of pandemics like the Black Death. Others argue that the isolation of the road and the lower population density meant that the risk was less than in a crowded town. The truth is likely that both were a factor. The road was a kind of conduit for disease, carrying it from one town to the next. And the travellers were the vectors. Remember the four humours? Travellers would often try to keep their humours in balance by eating and drinking what was local, but the diet of a traveller was often poor and unbalanced, and this could lead to sickness. They were also exposed to a variety of new germs and pathogens. The idea of traveller's stomach is not a modern invention. It was a reality of life on the road. You can almost taste the bitter tang of a bad meal, a subtle reminder of the risks you're taking with every step. This is a world where the journey itself was a test of your physical and spiritual resilience. You had to be tough, and you had to be willing to live in a state of constant dirtiness. And the simple act of travelling is now a complex story of a person trying to survive in a world that was determined to be unhygienic. The road was a metaphor for life itself. It was long, it was hard, and it was full of unseen dangers. You feel a sudden and powerful gratitude for the modern world's ability to travel in a clean, sanitized environment. The simple comfort of a clean hotel room is now a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the people around you. After considering the plight of the traveling pilgrim, your mind returns to the Black Death. But this time, you're looking at its most chilling and iconic symbol. A mainstream historical fact is that the plague doctor's mask, with its long, beak-like nose, was not a medieval invention, but a much later creation from the 17th century. It was part of a full uniform designed to protect the doctor from what they believed to be the cause of the plague, miasma, or bad air. You can almost see the figure now, a man in a long, dark coat, leather gloves, and that truly terrifying mask. A quirky tidbit is that the beak of the mask was filled with fragrant herbs, spices, and dried flowers, like mint, rose petals, and cloves. The idea was that these strong-smelling substances would purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs, a kind of primitive air filter. They believed that the foul stench of the plague was what caused the disease, so they fought it with a fragrant bouquet. This belief, of course, was completely wrong, but it shows a logical, if flawed, response to the information they had. Historians still argue whether the plague doctor's uniform was effective. Some scholars believe that the full leather coat and gloves, and the lack of exposed skin, actually did offer a degree of protection from the fleas that carried the disease, even if the doctors didn't understand the real reason why. Others argue that the uniform was primarily for psychological effect, to make the doctor look more intimidating and knowledgeable, and that it offered little to no real protection. The truth is likely that it was a combination of both. It was a visible sign of a professional trying to fight back against a terrifying and incomprehensible enemy, and it gave both the doctor and the patient a sense of hope, however false. Remember the reliance on superstition and faith you saw earlier. The plague doctor's uniform was a physical manifestation of this. It was a ritual, a piece of protective gear that was based on a flawed understanding of the world. The doctors were not scientists, they were practitioners of a system of belief, and their methods were a logical extension of that belief. The use of sweet-smelling herbs was a direct callback to the pomanders we talked about earlier. It was a way of creating a small, personal bubble of clean air in a world that was suffocatingly foul. The plague doctor's uniform is a powerful and sobering symbol. It's a reminder of a time when the most well-intentioned medical practices were based on guesswork and superstition, and when the line between life and death was incredibly thin. The silence in the sick room, broken only by the doctor's heavy breathing through his fragrant beak, is a powerful reminder of this. It's a world where a person's life was in the hands of a man who was fighting a battle he didn't understand, with tools that were ultimately useless. The ghost of that beak-like mask is a chilling, and often misunderstood, piece of history. With the chilling image of the plague doctor's mask still in your mind, you're now thinking about the animals that lived alongside medieval people. A mainstream historical fact is that the close proximity of humans and livestock was a major factor in the spread of disease. You've seen the pigs in the street and the horses pulling carts, but their relationship to humans was much more intimate and, at times, dangerous. You imagine a peasant's hut, a single room that is shared by the family and their animals. The chickens might roost in the rafters, the pigs might sleep in a small sty just outside the door, and the cow might be in a small shelter attached to the main building. A quirky tidbit is that people often brought their livestock inside during the coldest months to protect them from the elements and from thieves. This created an incredibly unhygienic environment where human and animal waste mingled, and a whole host of parasites and diseases could be passed back and forth. You can almost feel the presence of the flies and the fleas, a constant, low-level hum of living things. Historians still argue whether the practice of living with animals was a sign of a lack of hygiene or a necessary part of survival. Some scholars believe that the practice was simply a part of life, and that people understood the risks but had no other choice. Others argue that this close proximity was a major factor in the spread of zoonotic diseases, diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was a pragmatic solution to a problem that had no easy answer. The animals were too valuable to be left outside, but their presence inside created a constant source of filth and disease. Remember the filthy streets and the communal latrines. The waste from the animals was just as much a part of the landscape as the human waste. It was all a part of a single, interconnected, and unhygienic ecosystem. The simple act of living was a negotiation with the dirt and the disease that surrounded you. A simple scratch from a chicken could lead to a deadly infection, and a bite from a rat could be the first sign of a plague. The lack of a clear boundary between the human world and the animal world was a constant source of risk. This is a world where the idea of a separate, clean space for people and for animals is a fantasy. The two worlds were deeply intertwined, and a person's health was directly linked to the health of their animals. The lowing of a cow, the clucking of a chicken, and the snuffling of a pig were not just the sounds of the countryside, they were the sounds of a living, breathing ecosystem of germs and pathogens. The simple comfort of a clean home is now a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the people around you. They were a society that was living with, and often dying from, the consequences of their close relationship with the animals that sustained them. After contemplating the intimate, and often unhygienic, relationship between humans and animals, your mind begins to look for the first signs of a different way of thinking. This brings us to the very slow and difficult dawn of public health. A mainstream historical fact is that while the Middle Ages were a time of great ignorance about disease, there were early, rudimentary efforts to legislate sanitation in cities. These were not based on a scientific understanding of germs, but on a pragmatic desire to deal with the smell and the filth. You imagine a small group of town council members, not discussing the humours, but the state of the streets. A quirky tidbit is that in some cities, ordinances were passed to ban the throwing of waste from windows. The punishments were often fines or public shaming. You can almost see a man being led through the street, a chamber pot tied around his neck, a powerful and embarrassing symbol of his crime. These laws were often ignored, and they were difficult to enforce. But their very existence shows a nascent awareness that something had to be done. It was an acknowledgement that the problem was not just a personal one, but a communal one. Historians still argue whether these early laws were a genuine attempt at public health or simply a matter of aesthetics. Some scholars believe that the primary motivation was to make the cities look and smell better, to make them more civilized. Others argue that the laws were a clear, if rudimentary, attempt to improve the health of the population. The truth is likely a blend of both. They didn't know why the filth was making people sick, but they knew that it was associated with sickness, and that was enough to start the process of change. Remember the great stink of London we talked about? That was the final, and most dramatic and result of this long and difficult process. It took centuries of small, incremental changes to get to a point where a major public works project was even a possibility. The early laws were a starting point. They were a way of saying, this is not acceptable, even if they didn't have a solution. This is a world where progress is measured not in years, but in centuries. The simple idea of a government being responsible for the health of its citizens is a slow-growing one. You think about the people who lived in the village and their fatalistic view of disease. These laws were a small and often ignored rebellion against that fatalism. They were a way of saying, we can do better. We can be cleaner. It was a first step, a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The people who passed these laws were not heroes of hygiene, they were simply pragmatists. They saw a problem, and they tried to solve it with the limited tools they had. The simple act of a town council meeting is now a microcosm of this long and difficult journey. Following the early attempts at public health legislation, you now consider the personal objects of a medieval household. A mainstream historical fact is that in a world without a culture of personal hygiene, personal objects were often communal. A comb, a razor, and even a drinking cup were often shared by the entire family, and sometimes by the whole village. The idea of a personal, private item was a luxury that most people could not afford. You imagine a small wooden comb, its teeth worn and stained. It is passed from person to person, a simple tool that is used to deal with the constant problem of head lice and nits. A quirky tidbit is that in some households, a single razor would be used to shave the heads and faces of every male in the family. The razor was rarely cleaned, and it was a potential vector for a host of diseases. The simple act of a father shaving his son was an intimate ritual, but it was also a dangerous one. This is a powerful callback to the barber surgeon and his unsterilized tools. The same lack of understanding of germs was present in the home. Historians still argue whether the sharing of these personal objects was a significant cause of disease. Some scholars believe that it was a major factor in the spread of things like skin infections and parasites. Others argue that people's bodies were so used to the constant exposure to germs that it made little difference. The truth is likely that it was a constant, low-level source of contagion, a kind of background noise of filth that everyone had to live with. The simple act of brushing your hair was a shared experience, a moment of unhygienic intimacy. You see a family sharing a single, large drinking cup at the dinner table. The cup is passed from person to person, each taking a long drink. The idea of germs, of things being passed from one person to another, was not something they understood. It was simply how things were done. The cup was a symbol of community and trust, and no one would have thought to question it. The modern world's emphasis on personal drinking cups and sanitized surfaces would be seen as bizarre, and even rude. It would be an act of social rejection, a way of saying, I don't trust you. This is a world where the lines between public and private, and between clean and dirty, were incredibly blurry. Your personal items were not just yours, they were a part of the communal life of your family and your village. The simple comfort of a personal toothbrush is now a luxury that would have been unimaginable. The idea of a single, shared object being a source of disease is a terrifying one. You can almost feel the presence of the unseen germs, a silent, invisible ecosystem that was a constant and unwelcome guest in every home. After contemplating the shared objects of medieval life, your mind is now ready for a brief, but important, historical detour. You've seen the filth and the chaos of the Middle Ages, and now you'll reflect on a period that came before it, the Roman Empire. A mainstream historical fact is that the Romans were masters of sanitation. They had a complex system of aqueducts that brought fresh water into their cities, public latrines that were flushed with running water, and a system of public baths that was a marvel of engineering. This is a powerful and interesting callback to a world that had a very different relationship with hygiene. You imagine yourself in a Roman city, the streets are paved and clean, the air is fresh, and there's the constant, soothing sound of running water. You walk into a Roman bathhouse, not a medieval stew. The building is a massive, elegant structure with a series of rooms, the frigidarium, cold room, the tepidarium, warm room, and the caldarium, hot room. A quirky tidbit is that the Roman baths were heated by a system called a hypercaust, a network of underground furnaces that sent hot air under the floors and through the walls. This was a truly advanced form of central heating, a level of technology that was completely lost after the fall of the empire. Historians still argue whether the decline of Roman sanitation was a sign of a decaying civilization or simply a matter of economics. Some scholars believe that the fall of the Roman Empire led to a loss of the knowledge and engineering skills needed to maintain these complex systems. Others argue that the cost of maintaining the aqueducts and baths was simply too great, and that they were abandoned for economic reasons. The truth is likely a blend of both. The technology was a marvel, but it was also incredibly expensive and difficult to maintain. Remember the communal nature of medieval life? The Romans had a communal culture, too. But their communal spaces were clean and well maintained. The public latrines, where dozens of people could sit and chat, were flushed with a constant stream of water. The waste was carried away in a system of sewers that was a feat of engineering. The people of the Middle Ages didn't have this. They had to reinvent, or in some cases, simply do without. The knowledge of how to create a clean and sanitary city was not passed on, it was lost. This is a profound and humbling thought. It shows that history is not a straight line of progress. There are periods of advancement and periods of decline. The filth of the Middle Ages was not just a result of ignorance, it was also a result of a loss of a more advanced, and often forgotten, past. The simple, elegant solution of the Roman sewer system is now a powerful symbol of a civilization that understood the importance of hygiene on a massive scale. It's a testament to the idea that cleanliness is not just a personal choice, it's a social and political one. The ghost of a Roman aqueduct is a powerful and silent reminder of this. After the detour into the clean, Roman world, you're now back in the chaotic, medieval one, and your mind is making another fascinating connection. This time to a piece of language. A mainstream historical fact is that the term Privy Council has a surprisingly direct connection to the toilet. The Privy Council was a group of trusted advisors to the monarch. The word privy comes from the old French word privé, meaning private. A quirky tidbit is that the term was used because the council would meet in the king's private chambers, which included his private toilet, or privy. It was a place where a king was at his most vulnerable and, therefore, at his most trusting. It was a place where he could be alone with his thoughts and his most trusted advisors. Historians still argue whether the term was a literal or a figurative one. Some scholars believe that the council truly did meet in or near the king's privy, and that the term was a direct, albeit slightly crude, description. Others argue that it was a euphemism, and that the word privy simply meant private in a more general sense. The truth is likely that it was both. The toilet, even for a king, was a private space, a place where he could be alone. The fact that the most important political body in the kingdom was named after this space is a powerful and very human connection. It's a reminder that even for the most powerful people, the most basic bodily functions were a part of their daily life. Remember the guardrobe from a previous section? The king's privy would have been a more elaborate version of this. It would have been a small, private room, often with a wooden seat over a shaft that dropped straight down to the moat. It would have been cleaner and more private than the communal latrines of the common folk. But it was still a crude and smelly place. The simple act of a king going to the bathroom is now a microcosm of a society's priorities. It was a place of power, a place of trust, and a place where the most important decisions were made. It was a place where a person's vulnerability and their power were on full display. This connection between language and hygiene is a fascinating one. It shows that even in the most formal and serious parts of life, the realities of the body were never far away. The term Privy Council is a silent testament to this. It's a reminder that our language is filled with clues about the past, and that some of those clues are surprisingly and uncomfortably intimate. The next time you hear the phrase, you'll think of a king in his private chamber, and a group of advisors talking politics. It's a powerful and humbling thought, a quiet victory for the realities of the body over the formal and often stuffy world of history. From the private quarters of a king, you now find yourself back in the world of medicine, but in a much more practical and frankly squirm-inducing setting. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact, the widespread use of leeches and bloodletting as a medical treatment. This practice, which seems horrifying to our modern sensibilities, was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, a direct and logical consequence of the theory of the four humours we discussed earlier. You imagine a physician, or more likely, a barber surgeon, carefully selecting a fat, black leech from a glass jar. A quirky tidbit is that leeches were so common in medieval medicine that doctors often had special jars for their storage. The leech, a simple parasite, was a kind of living scalpel, a tool to remove what was believed to be a harmful excess of blood. You can almost feel the slimy, cold body of the leech on your skin, the pinch of its mouthparts as it latches on. The idea was to restore the balance of the humours. If you had a fever, it was because you had too much blood. The solution was simple: get rid of it. Historians still argue whether the practice of bloodletting did more harm than good. Some scholars believe that in some very rare cases, it might have been beneficial for things like high blood pressure, but that for the vast majority of illnesses, it was at best a useless ritual and at worst, a deadly one. Others argue that it was a psychological tool, a way for the patient to feel like something was being done, even if it wasn't. The truth is that it was a deeply flawed practice that was based on a flawed theory. The irony is that the same unhygienic conditions that were making people sick were also making the very treatments they were receiving dangerous. The scalpel used to make the incision, the jar where the leeches were kept, the blood that was collected, all of it was a potential vector for disease. Remember the plague doctor and his fragrant beak? The belief was that the miasma was the cause of the disease, but the bloodletting that the doctors performed was actually making people weaker and more susceptible to infection. It was a tragic combination of a lack of knowledge and a deep-seated belief in a system that was fundamentally wrong. The leeches themselves were often not clean. They were taken from ponds and rivers, and they were used over and over again. The simple act of a leech latching onto your skin is now a microcosm of a society that was so desperate for a cure that it was willing to risk everything. This is a powerful and sobering chapter in our journey. It reminds us that our modern medical care, with its emphasis on sanitation, sterile equipment, and trained professionals, is a hard-won victory. The simple act of a blood test is now a complex story of a society that was so desperate for a cure that it was willing to risk everything. The faint, metallic smell of blood is now a powerful and unsettling reminder of a world where a person's life was in the hands of a leech. After the bloodletting, you're now back in the chaotic and often overwhelming world of the medieval market. You've been observing the individual acts of unhygienic behaviour, but here, in the market, it's all on display at once. A sensory overload of sound, sight, and, most powerfully, smell. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval markets were a major source of filth and disease. They were the commercial heart of the town, but they were also a place where all the unhygienic practices you've seen came together in one, pungent, and terrifyingly unsanitized place. You imagine yourself walking through the narrow aisles. The air is thick with a mix of smells: the sweet smell of fresh bread, the earthy smell of vegetables, the sour smell of spilled ale, and, beneath it all, the powerful, acrid smell of animal waste and rotting food. A quirky tidbit is that people often bought their meat from open-air stalls, where it was exposed to flies, dust, and all manner of other contaminants. There was no refrigeration, of course, and the meat would be sold and consumed quickly. But in the summer months, the smell of decay would be a constant presence. You can almost see the buzzing cloud of flies, a silent and unhygienic attendant to every transaction. Historians still argue whether the medieval market was more of a health hazard than a benefit. Some scholars believe that the close proximity of people, animals, and food made it a perfect breeding ground for disease. Others argue that the market was a crucial part of the economy, and that the benefits of having access to fresh food outweighed the risks. The truth is that it was a combination of both. It was a necessary part of life, but it was also a place where a person's life was constantly at risk. The simple act of buying a loaf of bread was a negotiation with this reality. You had to trust that the baker's hands were clean, and that the flour had not been contaminated. Remember the communal nature of so much of medieval life? The market was the ultimate communal space. It was a place where all the classes and all the people came together. It was a place where news was exchanged and gossip was spread. But it was also a place where a single illness could be passed from one person to another in a matter of seconds. The simple act of a handshake, or a person coughing in your direction, was a potential vector for a deadly disease. The cacophony of the market, the haggling, the laughter, and the shouting is now a kind of soundtrack to a truly unhygienic experience. This is a world where the idea of a clean, sanitized public space is a fantasy. The market was a living, breathing ecosystem of filth and commerce. It was a place where people lived, worked, and died, all in the same few square feet. You feel a sense of profound relief for your own modern world. The simple act of going to a grocery store, with its sterile aisles and refrigerated cases, is a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the people around you. The smell of the market is now a powerful and unsettling reminder of a world that was both vibrant and deeply, profoundly dirty. After the sensory assault of the medieval market, you are now thinking about what happens after a bath, after a wash, or after a simple cleaning. What did people use to dry themselves? A mainstream historical fact is that towels, as we know them, were not a common household item. The idea of a personal, fluffy, absorbent towel was a luxury that was far in the future. Instead, people would use simple, coarse textiles, often made of linen or hemp, to dry themselves. You imagine a woman emerging from a bathhouse. A servant is waiting with a rough-hewn piece of cloth. A quirky tidbit is that these cloths were not just for drying the body, they were also used to rub the skin, a form of exfoliation that was believed to be good for the humours. The cloth would be harsh and scratchy, and it would leave the skin red and raw. It was a utilitarian tool, not a comfort item. The idea of a soft, gentle towel was a fantasy. Historians still argue whether the use of these coarse cloths was a sign of a more resilient body or simply a matter of a lack of comfort. Some scholars believe that people's skin was so used to the constant exposure to the elements and the rough clothing that they didn't mind the scratchiness. Others argue that it was simply a sign of a society that had not yet developed a culture of comfort. The truth is likely a blend of both. They were a people who were used to hardship, and a coarse towel was simply another part of life. Remember the communal nature of the bathhouse? The towels were often communal as well. A single cloth might be used to dry multiple people, a practice that, as you know, was a perfect vector for the spread of disease. This is a powerful callback to the shared objects we talked about earlier. The towel was not just a tool for drying, it was a symbol of the communal, and often unhygienic, nature of medieval life. The simple act of drying yourself is now a complex story of a society that was so desperate to be clean that it was willing to risk everything. This is a world where the idea of a soft, warm towel is a luxury that would have been unimaginable. The simple act of drying yourself is now a reminder of the long and often difficult journey of hygiene. You feel a new sense of gratitude for the simple, everyday objects of your own world. The soft, fluffy towel that you use every day is not just a comfort item, it's a silent testament to centuries of progress, a quiet victory in the long, and often difficult, war against filth. After the unpleasant sensation of the rough towel, you're now thinking about the people who made the various unguents and remedies you've seen. This brings us to the role of the apothecary, the medieval pharmacist and chemist. A mainstream historical fact is that apothecaries were crucial figures in urban life, as they were the source for a wide range of goods, from spices and herbs to medicines and even poisons. They were a mix of a modern pharmacist, a grocer, and a physician, and they were often the first person you went to when you were feeling ill. You imagine a small shop, filled with the pungent, earthy smells of dried herbs, the sweet smell of spices, and the slightly acrid smell of various chemicals. A quirky tidbit is that the apothecary's sign was often a mortar and pestle, a universal symbol of their craft. You can almost hear the soft, rhythmic sound of a pestle grinding herbs in a mortar, a kind of medieval ASMR. The apothecary was a person of great trust. As you were putting your life in their hands, historians still argue whether the apothecary's remedies were more effective than the folk remedies of the common people. Some scholars believe that the apothecary's knowledge, which was based on the writings of ancient physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, was more systematic and therefore more effective. Others argue that the folk remedies, which were based on generations of trial and error, were often just as good, if not better. The truth is likely a blend of both. The apothecary had access to a wider range of ingredients, and their remedies were often more complex. But the lack of a scientific understanding of disease meant that they were often just guessing. Remember the four humours? The apothecary was a direct product of this theory. Their remedies were designed to restore the balance of the humours, to purge the body of a harmful excess, or to add a missing ingredient. The simple act of a person going to the apothecary for a cure is now a complex story of a society trying to heal itself with the limited knowledge it had. The apothecary was a symbol of hope, a place where you could go and feel like something was being done. This is a world where the line between medicine and magic was incredibly blurry. The apothecary might sell you a remedy for a stomachache, but he might also sell you a charm to ward off evil spirits. He was a practitioner of both science and superstition, and his shop was a microcosm of a society that was trying to make sense of a world that was often terrifying and incomprehensible. The simple act of buying a remedy is now a complex story of a society trying to find a cure for a problem it didn't understand. With the world of the apothecary still on your mind, your attention now shifts to a very personal aspect of hygiene and aesthetics: body hair. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, the approach to body hair was a matter of personal choice and cultural norms, not a universal hygienic rule. The idea of a completely hairless body was not a widespread ideal, and the methods for removal were often crude and painful. You imagine a noblewoman plucking her eyebrows with a small pair of metal tweezers. A quirky tidbit is that women would often pluck their foreheads to create a higher hairline, a look that was considered fashionable at the time. They would also use a variety of concoctions, some of them made from toxic substances like arsenic and quicklime, to create depilatory creams. The idea was to remove the hair for aesthetic reasons, not for hygiene. You can almost feel the searing pain of the chemicals on the skin, a testament to the lengths people would go to for beauty. Historians still argue whether the removal of body hair was a sign of a more civilized society, or simply a matter of a fleeting fashion. Some scholars believe that the desire for a smooth, hairless body was a clear sign of a society that was moving away from the more natural and untamed look of the common folk. Others argue that it was simply a matter of aesthetics, and that the same people who were removing their hair would still be living in a dirty and unhygienic world. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was a personal choice, a way of expressing your social status and your personal style. Remember the dangerous cosmetics we talked about? The same lack of scientific knowledge that led to the use of lead in face paints also led to the use of toxic depilatories. They were a society that was so focused on the short-term goal of looking beautiful that they were willing to ignore the long-term consequences. The idea of a personal, clean, and safe method of hair removal is a luxury that would have been unimaginable. This is a world where every aspect of life, even the most personal, was a negotiation with a lack of technology and a deep-seated ignorance. The simple act of removing body hair is now a complex story of a society that was trying to be beautiful in a world that was determined to be dirty. The ghost of a medieval woman, with her plucked forehead and her smooth skin, is a powerful and unsettling reminder of this. With the topic of body hair behind you, your attention now shifts to the intellectual side of medieval life. You've seen the filth of the streets and the unhygienic practices of the people. But what about the places of learning? A mainstream historical fact is that a scholar's study or a monastic library was often a dusty, unkempt, and unhygienic place. The pursuit of knowledge did not necessarily go hand in hand with a desire for cleanliness. You imagine yourself in a small, cramped room, filled with stacks of parchment and scrolls. The air is thick with the smell of old paper, ink, and dust. A quirky tidbit is that scholars often worked in a perpetual state of grime. The ink would stain their fingers, and the dust from the parchment would settle on their clothes and their skin. There was no concept of a clean room for books or for study. The books themselves were a haven for dust mites and other pests. Historians still argue whether the lack of cleanliness in these spaces was a deliberate choice or simply a matter of a lack of resources. Some scholars believe that the scholars were so focused on their work that they simply didn't notice the dirt. Others argue that it was a clear sign of a lack of sanitation in every aspect of life, even in the most intellectual of pursuits. The truth is likely a blend of both. They were living in a world that was dirty, and their studies were no exception. Remember the animals living in the peasant's hut? The same principle applied to the scholar's study. The lack of a clear boundary between the human world and the animal world was a constant source of risk. The mice and rats that scurried through the room, the spiders that spun their webs in the corners, and the fleas that lived in the books were all a part of the ecosystem of the study. The simple act of reading a book was a negotiation with this reality. You had to be willing to live in a state of constant, low-level dirtiness. This is a world where the idea of a clean, pristine library is a fantasy. The pursuit of knowledge was a messy and unhygienic process. The books themselves, so precious and so rare, were a potential source of disease. The simple act of a scholar bending over a book is now a complex story of a society that was trying to be intelligent in a world that was determined to be dirty. The ghost of a dusty, unkempt study is a powerful and unsettling reminder of this. After the dusty confines of the scholar's study, your journey is nearing its end. You return to where it all began, the village well. This is a final, reflective stop, a way of tying together all the threads of this unhygienic tapestry. A mainstream historical fact is that the village well was not just a source of water, it was the lifeblood of the community. It was where people gathered, where gossip was exchanged, and where the most fundamental acts of daily life took place. You stand by the well, and you see a young girl slowly hauling up a bucket of water. The water looks pristine, but you know better. You remember the communal cesspits and the open sewers, and you know that the ground beneath your feet is a porous, living thing. A quirky tidbit is that in some communities, the well was protected by a small, carved shrine or a statue of a saint. A silent prayer that the water would remain pure. It was an acknowledgement that the well was a sacred space, a place of life, and that it was vulnerable to the forces of a dirty world. Historians still argue whether the well's central role in village life made it more or less hygienic. Some scholars believe that the constant foot traffic and the close proximity of people made it a potential source of contamination. Others argue that the well, because it was so central to life, was also the most carefully tended place in the village. The truth is that it was both. It was a place of life, but it was also a place of risk. The simple act of a girl hauling up a bucket of water is now a complex story of a society that was trying to survive in a world that was determined to be dirty. Remember the filthy streets, the communal latrines, the shared objects, and the lack of sanitation. The well was the antidote to all of this. It was a place where people could come and get a fresh start. It was a place where they could wash their hands, get a drink of water, and feel, if only for a moment, a sense of cleanliness. But you know that the well was a fragile thing, and that a single contaminated source could wipe out a whole village. The silence at the well, broken only by the creak of the rope and the splash of the water, is a powerful and unsettling reminder of this. This is a world where the idea of clean water is not a right, it's a luxury. The simple act of getting a drink of water is a profound one. It's a testament to the idea that cleanliness is not a personal choice. It's a social and a political one. The ghost of a contaminated well is a powerful and silent reminder of this. You now see the well not as a simple source of water, but as a symbol of life, of hope, and of the constant, and often losing, battle for cleanliness. Having now spent what feels like an age in this dusty, pungent, and fascinating world, you feel the pull of your own time. This is where we begin to ease out of the past and back into the present. A mainstream historical fact is that the journey from medieval filth to modern cleanliness was not a straight line. It was a long, winding, and often messy path, filled with trial and error, superstition, and a gradual, hard-won understanding of the invisible world of germs. You think about the chamber pot being tossed from the window, and you compare it to a modern-day waste disposal system. You think about the communal latrine and the private and clean bathroom in your own home. You think about the unfiltered well water and the bottled and purified water you can buy at any store. These are not just differences in technology, they are differences in a fundamental understanding of what it means to be a human being living in a community. A quirky tidbit is that the invention of the flush toilet, which we take for granted, was a slow and iterative process, with early models being invented in the 16th century but not becoming widespread until centuries later. It took a long time for the idea of a sealed, sanitary system to become a reality. Historians still argue whether the modern world's obsession with cleanliness is a sign of progress or a form of neurosis. Some scholars believe that our germ-phobic culture is a natural and necessary response to a world that is now hyper-aware of microbes and disease. Others argue that it has led to a weaker immune system and a detachment from the natural world. The truth is likely a blend of both. We have gained so much in terms of health and longevity, but we have also lost something in our connection to the raw, visceral reality of life. We are no longer a part of the ecosystem of dirt and disease in the same way our ancestors were. Remember the four humours: the bloodletting, and the plague doctor's mask. These were all logical, if flawed, responses to a world they didn't understand. We have the benefit of hindsight and the power of scientific discovery. The simple act of a doctor washing their hands before surgery is a quiet victory for all of humanity. It's a testament to the fact that we can learn, we can grow, and we can overcome our ignorance. The journey from medieval filth to modern cleanliness is a powerful story of human resilience and ingenuity. It's a story that is not just about technology, it's about a change in our very worldview. It's a story about a society that learned how to be clean, and a story that is still being written today. You feel the pull of your own world, a world of clean streets, fresh water, and the quiet comfort of your own home. The journey is almost over. You feel the modern world pulling you back, a gentle tide of quiet. Sterile air, the grime, the smells, and the chaos of the medieval world are beginning to recede. You're no longer in a village in 1350, you're here, with me, in the quiet of your own space. This final part is a gentle wind down, a slow release of the past so you can be fully present for the now. The sounds of the blacksmith's hammer and the distant lowing of a cow are fading. The memory of the chamber pot and the communal latrine is becoming a historical curiosity, not a tangible reality. You can let go of the phantom itch of the fleas and the unsettling feeling of the unwashed hands. The smells of the market, a mix of rotting food and fresh-baked bread, are dissipating into the ether. They were a part of a story that you have just experienced in a way that very few people get to. You have walked in a world without modern comfort, without our modern understanding of germs, and you have survived. You are now a time traveler, a person who understands, on a visceral level, how much we have gained in the last few centuries. The story of hygiene is not just about cleanliness, it's about progress. It's about humanity's long, slow journey from ignorance to understanding. It's about how we learn to tame the invisible world of microbes and to create a more comfortable and healthier life for ourselves. The stories you've heard tonight are not just facts from a history book, they are a part of a larger human story. A story that connects us all to a past that was both simpler and more dangerous than we can imagine. You can feel the quiet hum of your modern home, the clean, conditioned air, and the feeling of a world that has been scrubbed and sanitized for your comfort. Let all the images and sensations of the past drift away, like smoke from a distant fire. The sounds are fading, the smells are gone. All that is left is the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Your body is heavy. Your mind is at peace. The journey is over. There's nothing left to do now but to close your eyes, to breathe in the cool, clean air, and to let yourself drift. There are no more stories to tell tonight, no more history to explore, just the feeling of peace, of safety, and of a quiet, restful sleep. You are here, now, in this quiet moment. And you are safe. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.